I had gone camping alone plenty of times before, and I always thought of the woods as quiet, empty places where the worst you could run into was a stray coyote, or maybe a bear if you weren't careful with food. I liked the silence, the way the air cooled at night and how the ground seemed to swallow sound once the sun went down. That calm was what made me want to go again, deep into a stretch of forest where few people camped. I left early in the morning, packed with the usual gear: tent, sleeping bag, knife, small hatchet, stove, extra food, water filter, flashlight, batteries, and a first aid kit. I carried everything in a heavy backpack, and by the time I made it to the trailhead, the sun was already high. I wanted to be away from any campsites that had easy car access. I didn't want to hear kids screaming or people blasting music from their phones. I wanted to be where I couldn't hear anything but insects, the crack of twigs under my boots, and the sound of my own breath. The hike in was long. The first part of the trail was wide, dusty, and easy to follow, but after a couple of miles it narrowed into a path that wound through thick pines. I liked that. The ground was soft, covered with needles, and the deeper I went, the quieter it got. No sound of cars, no planes overhead, just the occasional bird call and the rustle of branches when a breeze slipped through. By mid-afternoon, I reached the area I had marked on my map. It was a small clearing, big enough for a tent, with a fallen log I could use as a bench and a shallow stream about 50 yards away, where I could get water. The clearing wasn't perfect. The ground was uneven in places, and a ring of dense brush made it feel more closed in than I liked. But it was far enough off the trail that nobody was likely to wander by. I set up my tent, gathered some dry branches for a fire later, and boiled water for a meal. When evening came, I sat by the fire and watched the light fade through the trees. The woods always changed at dusk. They went from feeling like a calm, open place to something else. Darker, heavier, like the trees were leaning closer and the shadows filled every gap. It was the same every trip, and I had learned to ignore it, but that night, for some reason, it hit me harder. I kept glancing at the brush line around my camp. The fire threw light on the branches, but beyond that, it was just black. I forced myself to relax, telling myself the same thing I always did. There was nothing out there. The woods at night only felt different because I couldn't see. My eyes made shapes out of nothing. I ate, cleaned my pot, and crawled into my tent. Inside, I stretched out in my sleeping bag, listening to the faint pop of the fire outside and the steady sound of insects buzzing. The air smelled of smoke and pine. I closed my eyes and waited for sleep to come, but it didn't. I lay awake longer than I usually did, restless, shifting in the bag. The ground under the tent felt uneven, like there was a root or rock I hadn't cleared away, but it wasn't bad enough to move. I tried to let my mind drift, but something kept nagging at me. It was a feeling, not a thought, like the sense that something wasn't right. At some point I realized I couldn't hear the insects anymore. The woods weren't silent, they never were, but the constant background buzz was gone. I lay still, straining to listen. That was when I heard it, a crack, sharp and clear like a stick breaking under weight. It came from the direction of the stream. I froze, every muscle tight, listening. Another sound followed, softer this time, like grass or leaves being pushed aside. Then nothing, just stillness, thick and pressing. My first thought was an animal, a deer maybe, or a bear passing through. I reached slowly for the knife I kept in the side pocket of my bag and held it against my chest. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Minutes passed. The sound didn't come again, and I told myself it was nothing, just a deer moving through. I tried to let it go, but I didn't fall asleep until much later. When I woke in the morning, the fire was dead and the clearing was quiet. Sunlight slanted through the trees, making the dew on the grass shine. I got up stiffly, stretched, and walked to the stream with my filter to get water. On the way back, I noticed something that made me stop. In the dirt near my camp, just beyond the clearing, there was a footprint. It wasn't mine. It was the shape of a boot, pressed into the soft soil. The tread was different than the pattern on my boots, and it looked fresh. I crouched down, staring at it, and felt my stomach twist. Someone had been near my camp. I looked around, scanning the brush and trees, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the woods were empty. I followed the footprint for a few steps, but it disappeared into the grass and leaves, swallowed by the ground. Whoever it belonged to hadn't stayed long. I spent the day trying to shake it off. People hiked out there sometimes, I told myself. Maybe someone had just passed by during the night. Maybe they didn't even notice my tent. It didn't have to mean anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it did. I went about the day, cooking, reading, walking a short way down the trail, but the whole time I felt watched. Every sound made me twitch, the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, even the wind pushing through the pines. That night I built a bigger fire than usual. I sat closer to it, staring at the flames, trying to convince myself I was safe. But when it came time to crawl into the tent, I couldn't relax. I left my flashlight in my hand, the knife next to me, and lay there with my ears straining for every sound. Hours passed. The fire outside died to a faint glow. Then I heard it again, a crack, closer this time, then another. I held my breath, staring at the dark fabric of the tent, every muscle rigid, the sound of leaves shifting. A faint scrape like a boot against stone. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet anymore. I turned the flashlight on and shone it against the side of the tent. The thin fabric glowed pale, but I didn't see anything. No shadow, no shape. I killed the light and listened again. Silence. Minutes dragged by. Then from the brush just outside the clearing came a new sound. Breathing. Slow, heavy, steady breathing. I felt ice run through me. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. Someone was standing just outside, breathing in the dark. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. My hand was slick on the handle of the knife, my chest tight with the effort of holding still. The breathing went on for what felt like forever. Then slowly it faded. The sound of steps moved back into the woods, crunching on twigs and leaves until there was nothing. I lay awake until morning, too afraid to sleep, every nerve stretched tight. When the sun finally came up, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, blinking in the light. There, in the dirt by the edge of the clearing, were more footprints, fresh. They circled the camp, coming within a few feet of the tent before moving away. Someone had been there. Someone had stood outside while I lay inside, pretending to sleep. I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed my gear fast, shoving everything into my pack with shaking hands. I doused the fire, slung the bag over my shoulders, and started back down the trail. I didn't stop to eat. I didn't stop for water. I just walked fast and steady, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. The woods didn't feel empty anymore. Every time the wind moved the branches, I flinched. Every sound made me think someone was behind me. By afternoon, I reached the wider part of the trail. Relief hit me hard. I was close to the trailhead, close to safety. That was when I saw it. Another footprint. In the dust of the wide trail, fresh, the same tread as the ones near my camp. My stomach dropped. Whoever it was had followed me. I didn't run, but I walked faster, almost jogging, my breath ragged and sharp in my chest. The trail twisted and dipped, and every time I looked back, I thought I saw movement in the trees. When I finally reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there. The sun was low, the light turning gold. I yanked open the door, threw my pack inside, and started the engine. As I pulled out, I glanced in the rearview mirror. At the edge of the trees, half hidden in shadow, was a figure, tall still, watching. I didn't look back again. I drove until the woods were far behind me, until I was on the highway surrounded by other cars, other people. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I never went camping alone again. I always thought camping alone would give me peace. I had gone on short trips before, but always with someone else. Friends, cousins, or a small group. There was always chatter, laughter, firelight bouncing on faces, and the comfort of knowing someone else was listening when the forest creaked. This time I wanted something different. I wanted silence, space, and that strange kind of focus you only get when you're away from everyone. I planned it for weeks, bought gear, packed carefully, and picked a location far enough off the regular trails where I wouldn't run into many people. I left home early that morning and drove for hours. The road narrowed as I got closer to the mountains, the trees taller, shadows falling across the car even though the sun was still high. I parked near a ranger station, signed in, and then took a dirt road as far as I could. My backpack was heavy when I threw it on my shoulders, but I felt good. I had water, food, a tent, a knife, bear spray, and a headlamp. I wasn't careless. I wanted solitude, not danger. The trail stretched quiet, pine needles soft under my boots, the smell of sap in the air. A breeze moved through the branches. I didn't see anyone, which was exactly what I wanted. I walked for hours deeper into the trees, checking the map every so often. My plan was to set up camp near a stream I had marked earlier, far from where most people went. I wanted to be alone with the forest. By late afternoon, I reached the spot. The stream cut through the trees, clear water rushing over rocks, cold to the touch. I found a flat patch of ground nearby and cleared it for my tent. I set up carefully, staking the corners deep, rolling out my sleeping bag, making sure everything was in place before night came. I gathered wood for a small fire and ate a quick meal of jerky and trail mix, washing it down with water from my bottle. The first night was quiet, too quiet. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, listening to the forest. There were sounds, of course. A distant owl, rustling in the brush, the faint gurgle of the stream. But no voices, no cars, no planes, just me. At first it felt peaceful, but the longer I sat there, the heavier the silence grew. Every crack of a branch made me glance up. Every rustle felt closer than it was. By the time I put out the fire and crawled into my tent, my nerves were stretched tight. Inside, the thin walls of fabric didn't feel like much protection. I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to slow my breathing. Something walked through the leaves outside. It could have been a deer, could have been anything. The steps were slow, deliberate, not rushing through. They came close enough that I could hear the leaves crunching clearly, then stopped. I held my breath, waiting, ears straining. After a long time, the steps moved away. I stayed awake until exhaustion finally forced my eyes shut. Morning felt like safety. Sunlight cut through the trees, making the tent warm. I unzipped it and stepped outside. Nothing was disturbed, just forest, calm and green. I shook off the unease and told myself I had overreacted. Animals moved at night. That was all. I boiled water, made instant coffee, and ate oatmeal while watching the stream glint in the sun. The tension from last night seemed silly in daylight. I spent the day exploring. I followed the stream looking for fishing spots, though I hadn't brought a rod. I found tracks in the mud, hoof prints, maybe deer, maybe elk. I collected more wood, cleaned up the camp, and took notes in a small notebook I carried. The forest was alive with small noises during the day. Birds, insects, the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. My body relaxed with each passing hour. By evening, I had settled in again. I made another fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat watching the flames dance. Dusk fell slowly, shadows thickening. I could feel the temperature drop. The same nervousness from the night before crept back as the forest darkened. I told myself it was normal. Night in the woods always felt bigger than day. That night, though, I didn't just hear footsteps. I found something. I had gone to the edge of the trees to relieve myself, my headlamp cutting through the dark. When I came back, I noticed the ground near my campfire looked disturbed. At first, I thought it was just where I had stepped earlier. But then I saw prints. Not paw prints, not hooves. Shoes. They weren't mine. The tracks circled near the fire pit close to my tent, then led back into the woods. They weren't deep, which meant they were fresh, maybe just hours old. The hair on the back of my neck lifted as I crouched to study them. The size looked average, maybe a man's boot. My chest tightened. I hadn't seen anyone all day. The trail I had come on was miles away. No reason for anyone else to be this deep. Not unless they were doing the same thing as me. But why would they come so close to my camp and then leave without saying anything? I hardly slept that night. Every sound outside the tent made me flinch. Branches cracking, leaves moving. I lay there gripping the knife I kept by my side, staring at the tent walls. At some point I must have drifted off, but it felt like minutes. When daylight came, I unzipped the tent and looked around carefully. The tracks were still there, leading away into the trees. I followed them for a few yards before they vanished into harder ground. Whoever it was had come close, stood there, then gone back into the forest. I told myself maybe it was a hunter. Maybe they saw my fire, came to check, then left. But deep down it didn't sit right. No hunter would sneak around a stranger's camp at night without saying a word. I should have packed up and left. That thought crossed my mind more than once. But I told myself I was overreacting. I had planned this trip for weeks. I had food, water, everything I needed. Leaving now would make me feel like a coward. So I stayed. The third night was worse. I built my fire higher, hoping it would keep anything away. The shadows seemed to press in tighter, the silence thicker. I sat with my back against a log, knife close, eyes darting at every flicker. Hours dragged on. Then I heard it. Not footsteps this time, breathing. It was faint, but it was there. Slow, steady human breathing coming from the trees just beyond the firelight. I froze, ears straining, barely able to believe it. The fire crackled. My own breath rasped loud in my ears. But under it I heard someone out there, watching, breathing. I stood slowly, my knife in hand, staring into the dark. The sound stopped. Just silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat by the fire until dawn, eyes burning, waiting for something to move. When the first light hit, I searched the tree line. Nothing. No tracks this time. But I knew what I heard. By now the peace I had wanted was gone. My stomach knotted every time I thought about staying. Still, I told myself I would make it through one more night. I wanted to believe I could. I wanted to think I wasn't scared off by my imagination. That day I kept close to camp, listening, watching. I thought about packing up early, but I felt trapped between pride and fear. The woods around me seemed different now. Every movement in the distance felt like eyes. Every crack of a branch made me spin. When night came, I didn't light a fire. I thought maybe the fire had been drawing whoever it was. Instead, I sat in the dark, listening, knife across my lap. The forest was a black wall around me. Hours passed, slow and heavy. My eyes strained against the dark. My ears caught every sound. And then, just past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Careful, slow, coming closer. I held my breath, heart pounding so hard it hurt. The steps stopped just at the edge of camp. Silence. Then a whisper of movement, like someone shifting weight from one foot to the other. I gripped the knife until my hand ached. I wanted to call out, but I couldn't. My throat had locked. I just sat frozen, staring into the dark. The steps moved again, circling. I could hear leaves crunching softly, moving around me, behind me, then stopping. Whoever it was, they were close. Watching. I stayed like that until the sky began to pale. At first light, the sounds were gone. I packed fast, stuffing everything into my bag with shaking hands. I didn't care about neatness. I just wanted out. The hike back felt endless. Every turn of the trail, I expected someone to step out. Every sound behind me made me spin. My chest was tight, breath short, legs trembling. When I finally reached the ranger station, I signed out with a shaky hand. The ranger barely looked at me, just nodded. I didn't say anything. I didn't know what to say. By the time I reached my car, I felt like I had been holding my breath for days. I threw the pack into the back seat, locked the doors, and sat gripping the steering wheel, heart still hammering. I had gone into the forest looking for quiet. I found something else. Someone had been out there with me, moving in the dark, circling my camp, breathing just beyond the trees. They never showed themselves, never spoke, never did anything but watch. But that was enough. On the drive home, the trees slid past the windows, endless and dark. I realized I would never forget that sound. The slow, steady breathing just outside the firelight. And I knew one thing for certain. I would never camp alone again. I remember that trip more than any other. I have been camping plenty of times in my life. In forests, on lakesides, sometimes near mountains. I always thought I understood the outdoors. I thought I knew what to expect. What noises belonged to animals, what feelings came from being alone in the woods. But that one trip was different. It felt random. Just something I decided to do because I was bored of my routine. But it turned into the kind of memory that never goes away. It was early autumn, late September. The days were warm, but the nights were already turning sharp and cold. The leaves hadn't fully changed colors yet, but you could see the hints of orange and yellow starting to creep through the green. The air had that dry, faint smell of leaves that had just begun to fall. I had been sitting in my apartment all week, restless, scrolling through my phone, and the idea of going camping popped into my head. I didn't plan it for weeks like I usually do. I didn't invite anyone. I just shoved my gear into the trunk of my car one Friday afternoon, drove out of town, and headed north toward a national forest that I'd only camped in once before. The drive was long, about 4 hours, and I reached the ranger station around dusk. There weren't many people around. I signed in quickly, paid for the permit, and the ranger pointed me toward the deeper side of the forest where the more remote campsites were. By then the light was already fading, and I remember feeling a little uneasy because I didn't want to set up camp in the dark. But I kept driving anyway, telling myself I'd be fine. By the time I pulled off onto the narrow dirt road that led to the site, the last light was fading from the sky. I parked, grabbed my pack, and started down the path into the woods. The trees were tall pines mixed with some oaks, and the ground was covered in a thick carpet of needles. The trail wasn't long, maybe a half mile, but it felt longer because I could barely see. The forest swallowed up what little light remained. My flashlight cut through the dark in a narrow beam, and each crunch of my boots sounded too loud. When I finally reached the site, it was nothing fancy, just a small clearing with a fire ring made of stones and a flat spot for a tent. I dropped my pack and got to work fast. My hands were stiff from the cold, but I managed to set up the tent, roll out my sleeping bag, and gather some wood for a fire. The air smelled faintly of damp soil, and when I struck the lighter and got the fire going, the warmth felt like a shield against the heavy blackness pressing in all around me. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, just canned soup heated in a small pot. I ate quickly, staring into the flames, trying not to think too hard about how quiet it was. No voices, no cars, no planes overhead, just the occasional rustle of leaves when the wind moved through. I had camped alone before, but something about the silence here made me feel like I was too far from everything. Still, I tried to relax. When I finished eating, I buried the scraps, doused the pot, and threw more wood on the fire. I sat back against my pack, staring at the shadows jumping across the tree trunks. Every now and then I would hear something small move in the brush. Probably squirrels, maybe raccoons. I kept telling myself that. The hours crawled by. At one point I thought I heard footsteps on the trail, slow and heavy, but when I pointed my flashlight that way, the beam hit nothing but trees. I sat there frozen, waiting for something else, but the sound didn't return. I told myself it was just the forest playing tricks. Sound bounces strangely in the woods at night. By midnight, the fire had burned low. The cold was creeping in, so I crawled into my tent. I zipped the flap shut, pulled the sleeping bag up around me, and tried to close my eyes. For a while I dozed, half awake, drifting in and out. That was when I heard it again, the sound of movement. Slow, deliberate crunches on the pine needles, closed this time. Too heavy for a squirrel, too slow for a deer. I held my breath. My ears strained against the silence. The sound moved around the clearing, one step at a time, as if someone or something was circling. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wanted to unzip the tent and shine my flashlight, but fear pinned me down. I told myself maybe it was just the wind knocking branches down, but deep inside I knew it wasn't. After what felt like an hour, the sounds faded. I didn't sleep much after that. Every rustle made me jolt awake. When morning came, the forest looked normal again. The sunlight poured through the trees, birds chirped, and everything seemed harmless. I stepped out of the tent and checked the ground. At first I didn't notice anything unusual, but then I saw it. About 20 feet from the tent in the soft earth near the fire ring, there was a footprint. Not a boot print like mine, not a paw, a bare human foot. It was long and narrow, pressed deep into the dirt as if someone had stood there watching. A cold wave ran through me. I hadn't heard anyone approach during the day. No voices, no campers. This was supposed to be a remote site. But that footprint was fresh. It hadn't been there the night before when I set up. I tried to calm myself, telling myself maybe some hiker wandered through. Maybe it was nothing. But the print was angled toward my tent. It felt too intentional. I packed up my food and carried it farther from camp, hanging it high between two trees to keep animals out. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. That day I hiked a short loop trail nearby, trying to distract myself. The forest was beautiful, streams cutting through mossy rocks, sunlight filtering in beams through the tall pines. But I couldn't enjoy it. Every snapping twig behind me made me spin around. I didn't see anyone, but the tension never let go. When I got back to camp in the afternoon, I saw something else that froze me in place. On the edge of the clearing, tucked near a tree, there was a small pile of rocks stacked one on top of the other. It hadn't been there that morning. The stones were carefully balanced like a marker. I told myself maybe I just hadn't noticed it before. But deep down I knew I would have. It was too deliberate, too strange. That night the fear returned full force. I built a larger fire, letting the flames climb high, hoping the light would keep whatever was out there away. I sat with my back against the tent, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other. The woods felt alive, like they were waiting. It started again around midnight. The footsteps, slow, steady circling. I held my breath, staring at the shadows beyond the firelight. At one point I thought I saw a figure just beyond the ring of light, standing still between two trees. Tall, motionless. When I blinked and shined the beam, it was gone. The steps continued until almost dawn. I never slept. By morning I was exhausted. I thought about leaving, but something stubborn in me said I should stay. I had driven all this way, set up all my gear. I didn't want to feel like I was running from nothing. That was a mistake. On the third night, I tried to tire myself out by hiking farther during the day. When I got back, the rock pile had grown taller. More stones carefully stacked. My stomach turned when I realized someone had been there again while I was gone. Watching, waiting. I built the biggest fire yet, but it didn't help. The noises came earlier that night, before the sun had even fully set. Twigs breaking, pine needles crunching. At one point I heard a low, steady breathing just outside the tent wall, like someone crouched right there, inches from me. I gripped the knife so hard my hand ached. My body was frozen in place. I thought about screaming, but the sound caught in my throat. Hours passed like that, every sound magnified, until I thought I would lose my mind. When the first light of dawn came, I made my decision. I wasn't staying another night. I packed quickly, shoving everything into my pack without care. My hands shook as I tore down the tent. When I turned to grab my bag from the ground, I stopped cold. There was another footprint. This one was pressed deep into the dirt, only a few feet from where I had been sleeping. Bare, human, pointed straight at me. I should have left calmly, but panic took over. I yanked my pack onto my shoulders and bolted down the trail. Every step I expected to hear someone chasing me. My chest burned, my legs screamed, but I didn't stop until I reached my car. When I finally slammed the door shut and locked it, I sat there shaking, drenched in sweat. I turned the key, floored the gas, and didn't look back. I don't know who was out there. Maybe some stranger living off the grid. Maybe someone who liked to stalk campers for reasons I don't want to think about. All I know is that I was watched, night after night, and they wanted me to know it. That trip taught me more about fear than anything else ever has. I haven't camped alone since. Even when I go with friends, I never stop checking the shadows, never stop listening for footsteps that shouldn't be there. Because the scariest part wasn't what I saw or heard. It was knowing that in those woods, miles from anyone else, someone was close enough to touch my tent, close enough to watch me sleep, and I never once heard them leave. I had been camping most of my life, but I had never gone alone until that trip. It was in late September, when the nights were cold enough that most people avoided the woods, but not so late into the year that the trails were covered in snow. I picked a spot far off the beaten path, away from marked campgrounds and other people. That was the draw for me. The silence, the emptiness, the feeling that I was the only one for miles. I wanted to be cut off, wanted to test myself, wanted to see if I could handle the weight of total solitude. I packed light but careful. A small tent, a sleeping bag rated for freezing nights, a headlamp, 2 flashlights with spare batteries, a camp stove, a knife, enough food for 4 days, a metal water bottle, and a filter pump. I had my boots, layered clothes, and a heavy jacket for the night. The trail I chose was one I had studied on maps and satellite images. It started as a dirt road, then broke off into smaller footpaths that twisted into thick forest. The spot I aimed for was near a creek with a clearing big enough for a tent. It was remote enough that I was sure no one else would be around. The first day went smooth. The air was cool, sharp with pine and damp leaves. My boots crunched over fallen branches and I could hear the creek long before I reached it. I set up camp in the clearing just before sunset. The ground was soft with pine needles and the creek water was cold and clear. The sound of it running over rocks carried through the clearing, constant but quiet enough to blend into the background. I got my tent up, unpacked my bag, and cooked a small meal as the sky turned orange, then darkened to purple and black. The first night alone in the woods was calm, with nothing but the sound of crickets, the water, and an occasional owl calling from far off. It was on the second night that the feeling started. I had been hiking during the day, wandering further upstream, then circling back to camp before it got too late. The sun dipped fast, and by the time I boiled water for dinner, the woods were swallowed in darkness. The glow from my small camp stove looked fragile compared to the shadows pressing against the edges of the clearing. I ate, cleaned up, and sat in my camp chair with my headlamp off, letting my eyes adjust to the dark. The stars spread across the sky, cold and sharp. That was when I noticed it. An unease that I couldn't explain at first. It wasn't noise. It was the opposite. The night had gone still, as if the woods were holding their breath. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no owls. Just the water of the creek and my own breathing. My stomach tightened, though I told myself silence was natural, that animals sometimes went quiet all at once. But the longer I sat, the stronger the unease grew. My skin prickled as if eyes were on me. I told myself it was just being alone, my mind exaggerating every small thing, but the weight of it pressed harder than reason could explain. I went into my tent earlier than usual, zipped the flap, and lay in my sleeping bag with my headlamp close. I listened. The silence outside stretched for hours. Every time I started to drift, I would snap awake, sure I had heard something faint. A step, a snap of wood, a shuffle in the brush. When I finally slept, it was shallow and restless. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the clearing. I found nothing unusual, no tracks, no broken branches, nothing to prove anyone or anything had been there. The woods looked ordinary. I told myself I was fine. Still, when I went out hiking that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me. Every time I stopped, the silence pressed in and I would turn, scanning the trees. There was never anything. Just endless trunks, shadows, and the sound of the creek somewhere behind me. That night was worse. I had just finished cleaning up after dinner when I noticed something out of place near the creek. At first I thought it was nothing, just rocks and branches shifting in the current, but when I focused, I saw it clearly. On the opposite bank, half hidden by brush, something pale stood out against the dark. I moved closer, squinting across the water. It was a rock, I thought. Maybe a piece of driftwood lodged there. I convinced myself it was nothing. But when I woke the next morning and went to refill my water bottle, the pale shape was gone. That was when the fear started to take root. By the third night, I didn't want to be there anymore. My food was fine, my gear was fine, but my mind wasn't. I told myself I'd stay one more night and leave early the next morning. As the sun went down, I built a small fire instead of using the stove. The flames made me feel safer, though I kept them low, careful not to let sparks rise too high. I sat by the fire until late, watching the woods beyond the glow. My eyes darted at every movement, every shadow. Once I was sure I saw a figure between the trees, standing still. I stared so hard my eyes watered, but when I blinked it was gone. Or maybe it had never been there at all. I crawled into my tent, zipped it tight, and lay awake, clutching the flashlight. My ears strained at every sound. The creek ran, the fire popped, then went quiet as the coals cooled. That was when I heard it, a single crunch. A footstep on dry ground, close enough that I froze in place. My breath caught. Another crunch followed, slower, closer. Whoever or whatever it was, they were outside my tent. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My mind raced through options. Yell, unzip the tent, shine the light, but I stayed still, listening. The steps circled, pausing now and then like someone was walking carefully, testing the ground. They stopped near the creek, then silence again. I lay there wide-eyed until dawn finally came. When I stepped outside, my stomach dropped. In the dirt near my tent were prints, human prints, bare feet. They circled the tent once, then led back toward the trees. I wanted to pack up and leave right then, but the trail out was long and I told myself daylight was safe. Whoever had been there was gone now. Maybe it was just some strange loner passing through. Someone who didn't mean harm. But the bare feet unsettled me. No one hikes that far without shoes. No one sane, at least. That day I stayed close to camp, unwilling to wander far. I kept looking at the tree line, expecting to see someone standing there. The woods were quiet in a different way now. Not the silence of nature, but a silence with weight, like something waiting. I barely ate. I barely moved. By evening I had made up my mind. I was leaving at first light. The final night was the worst. I didn't bother with a fire. I wanted no light, nothing to draw attention. I sat in the dark, back against a tree, waiting. Hours dragged by. My body was tight with nerves, every sound making me twitch. Then it came again, the steps. Slow, deliberate, circling the clearing. I could hear them clearer this time. Not an animal. Not random. They stopped and started moving closer, then fading, then returning. My throat was dry, my chest tight. At one point I heard the faint sound of breathing, low and steady, just beyond the trees. I didn't sleep at all. When dawn finally bled through the branches, I packed in minutes. My hands shook as I stuffed the tent into its bag. I strapped everything to my pack and started down the trail fast, barely stopping to catch my breath. The woods felt different now, heavy, hostile. Every snap of a twig behind me made me spin. I didn't see anyone, but I felt them. Following. Watching. Hours later, when I finally reached the dirt road, I let myself breathe. The wide space of the road felt safer than the closed trees. I walked the last stretch until I reached my car, parked where the trail began. My legs were weak, my chest sore from tension. I threw my gear into the back seat and sat behind the wheel, gripping it hard. That was when I saw it. On the trunk of my car, smeared into the dust of the paint, were 2 handprints. Bare, dirty, pressed flat. I drove without stopping until I was miles away, the woods shrinking in the rearview mirror. I never went back. That was the end of my trip. It wasn't the weather, or the trail, or the loneliness that broke me. It was the clear truth that someone had been out there with me the whole time. They never spoke, never showed themselves fully, never attacked. They just watched, walked, circled, left their prints where I could find them. And that was enough. Enough to make sure I never camped alone again. I had gone camping many times before, but that trip was different. I still think about it often, even though I wish I could forget it. The memories are sharp and heavy, and every time I picture those woods, I can still feel the weight of that night pressing on me. I tell myself nothing supernatural happened because nothing did. It was all real, made worse by the fact that I couldn't fully prepare for the kind of danger that comes from other people, not the woods themselves. I went out alone. I had been dealing with a lot of stress at the time and wanted to clear my head. Work had been rough and I felt boxed in by noise and constant demands. Being outside, away from people, had always been the one way I could get my mind to settle. I chose a spot deep in a national forest that wasn't too far from home, but still remote enough that I wouldn't run into many people. It was a weekday too, so I figured I'd have the place to myself. The drive out was calm. I watched the road turn from pavement to gravel and then narrow down into a dirt path that wound between tall pines and patches of open grass. The air smelled fresh, that sharp, clean scent of pine needles mixed with dirt. I parked in a small pull-off where the trees crowded close to the road and started unloading my gear. I had my pack, a tent, a sleeping bag, food, water, and a small camp stove. The trail I planned to take wasn't official, but I had found it before on maps. It was faint. More like an old logging road that had grown over with time but still usable. I hiked in slow, my boots crunching through leaves and small twigs. Every so often I would stop and listen. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird or the rustle of wind through branches. That kind of silence always felt heavy, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. After about 2 hours of steady walking, I found a clearing by a small creek. The ground was flat and soft enough for a tent, and the water was close enough for washing and cooking. It felt perfect, tucked away with enough open space to see around but still surrounded by dense trees that kept the wind down. I set up camp carefully, driving the tent stakes deep and laying out my gear inside. I stacked wood for a fire later and sat on a log to eat a snack. Everything felt normal, almost peaceful. The only sounds were the water moving over rocks and the distant call of birds deeper in the woods. As the sun dropped lower, I went about my usual routine. I boiled water, cooked some food, and ate while sitting by the creek. I felt good, calm in the quiet, and for a while I thought the trip would be exactly what I needed. I gathered more firewood before dark, making sure I had enough to keep a flame going well into the night. By the time the sky turned orange and purple, I had a decent fire crackling in the ring of stones I built. The first sign that something was off came after the sun had set completely. The fire was bright, throwing shadows against the trees, and I sat with my back to my tent, just staring into the flames. That's when I heard it, a faint crunch of leaves far off but clear in the stillness. At first I brushed it off. Animals move through the woods all the time and the sound wasn't close. But then it came again, slower, like someone trying to step lightly but not light enough. I held still and listened harder. The fire popped, sending sparks into the air, and for a few moments there was nothing else. Then another crunch came, this time to my left. I turned my head slowly, trying not to move too much, but I couldn't see anything past the glow of the fire. The woods beyond were dark, almost solid with shadow. My heart picked up. I told myself it was probably just deer or something similar, but something about the rhythm of the steps bothered me. They weren't quick or random. They were spaced out, deliberate. I tried to ignore it, forcing myself to sit back down and focus on the fire, but I could feel my skin prickling like I was being watched. Eventually, the noise stopped. I sat there for a long time waiting, but nothing else came. When I finally crawled into my tent, I left the fire burning low, just enough to give light. I lay on my back in my sleeping bag, staring at the thin nylon roof above me, listening to every faint sound outside. My ears picked up things I normally wouldn't have noticed: branches shifting, the creek moving, the occasional snap of a twig. My mind turned every sound into something approaching. Sleep came in short, broken pieces. I woke several times in the night, each time thinking I heard footsteps near camp. At one point, I was sure I heard breathing outside the tent, faint but steady. I froze in my bag, holding my breath, listening so hard it hurt. After what felt like forever, it faded away, or maybe it was never there. I couldn't be sure. Morning light finally crept through the tent walls, and I got up feeling drained. My fire had burned out, and the woods were back to their normal morning calm. For a while, I almost convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing. It was easy to chalk it up to nerves, being alone in the woods, hearing too much in the dark. I cooked breakfast, drank some coffee, and tried to relax. The day passed slowly. I explored up the creek, followed a few deer trails, and gathered more wood. Nothing strange happened, and by late afternoon I was starting to feel foolish about how tense I'd been. But as the sun dropped again, that tightness in my chest returned. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was worse when the light faded, as if the dark itself pressed closer around the camp. I kept the fire bigger that night, feeding it often, sitting close to it like it was a shield. The sound started earlier this time. Faint steps in the distance, a branch breaking where no wind moved. Every time I turned my head, I saw nothing beyond the circle of light. My hands stayed tight on the hatchet I kept by my side. At one point, I stood up and walked a few paces toward the sound, shining my flashlight into the trees. The beam cut through branches and brush but showed nothing. The wood swallowed the light fast, leaving only blackness beyond. My skin crawled and I backed up to the fire. Hours passed like that. I was too wired to sleep, so I sat there, eyes heavy but mind sharp with fear. Then came the sound that still sticks with me, the unmistakable rip of fabric. It was faint, but I knew it. I spun and shined the light toward my tent. The side closest to the trees had a long, fresh tear down the nylon. I froze, the beam of my flashlight shaking in my hand. My pack was still inside, half pulled through the tear like someone had tried to drag it out. The air in my chest turned heavy, and I felt my legs tremble. Whoever had been out there wasn't just watching anymore. They had come right into my camp, close enough to touch my gear while I sat only feet away by the fire. I yanked my pack out, pulled it close to me, and kept the hatchet in my other hand. The rest of the night was a blur of fear. Every time the fire dimmed, I added more wood, too scared to let it die. My ears caught every single sound, and each one felt like it was moving closer. By dawn, I had made my choice. I wasn't staying another night. As soon as the light was strong enough to see, I packed everything in a rush. My tent was useless now, slashed open, so I stuffed it into my bag without folding. My hands shook the whole time. I didn't even eat. I just threw things together and slung the pack on my shoulders. The hike back felt endless. Every few minutes I stopped and looked behind me, sure I would see someone following. The woods were quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It felt empty, like whoever had been there was waiting just out of sight. I walked faster than I ever had, heart hammering, sweat soaking through my shirt. When I finally saw my car through the trees, I almost ran. The sight of it sitting there on the dirt pull-off felt unreal, like I'd stepped out of another world. I threw my pack inside, started the engine, and didn't look back until I hit the paved road. Even then, I couldn't shake it. My rearview mirror became my enemy. Every passing car made me tense, every shadow felt alive. When I got home, I left the gear piled in the garage and sat in silence for a long time. The woods had always been a place of peace for me, but now they carried weight. I never saw who it was. I never knew if it was one person or more or what they wanted, but the rip in my tent proved they were real. They weren't animals, and they weren't figments of my imagination. They had been there, close enough to touch the things I depended on. I still camp, though less often, and never alone anymore. I always keep my gear close, and I never stray too far from where I can get out fast. That trip taught me something hard but simple. Nature itself isn't the only danger out there. Sometimes it's the people who find you when you think you're hidden, the ones who watch from the dark and wait for the right moment. And when I close my eyes at night, I still see that torn nylon flapping in the firelight, proof that I was never really alone in those woods. I decided to go camping alone in late September, a little before the cold of October set in. I had always liked the idea of being away from people, away from noise, just me in the woods. I had camped before, but always with others. This was the first time I was truly on my own. I thought I was prepared. I had my tent, my sleeping bag, a good knife, food, a lantern, and extra batteries. I wanted to test myself, to see if I could handle the quiet, the dark, and the long hours with nothing but trees around me. The place I picked was about 5 miles from the main road. I parked my car in a small gravel pull-off, slung my pack over my shoulders, and hiked in. The trail was narrow and covered in fallen leaves. The air was cool, damp with the smell of earth, and every now and then I could hear something move in the brush. Birds mostly, squirrels sometimes. I told myself that was all it was. It took me about 2 hours to reach the spot I had chosen ahead of time. I had looked at maps, checked satellite images, and marked an area that had a clearing near a creek. When I got there, I felt proud of myself. The clearing was perfect. The ground was level, the trees open just enough for a tent, and the sound of running water from the creek was close enough to be useful, but far enough not to drown everything out. I set up my tent, unpacked my gear, and collected some firewood. The hours passed quickly. By late afternoon, I had a small fire going and was boiling water for noodles. The flames crackled low, sending sparks into the air. The forest around me had started to quiet down. Birds weren't calling as much. Squirrels had stopped moving. That's normal, I thought. Animals go still before night. As the sky darkened, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not excitement, not peace, but unease. The silence wasn't like the silence of my room at home. It was heavier, thicker. Even the creek sounded different in the dark, louder somehow, rushing through the quiet. I tried to push it out of my head. I ate. cleaned my small pot, and sat by the fire as the stars came out. When night fully settled, the trees looked like walls of black around me. I couldn't see past them. The fire lit the clearing, but just beyond the light, everything was swallowed. I added another branch to the fire and tried to relax, but every sound pulled my attention. A stick cracking, leaves shifting, something moving through the brush. I reminded myself over and over that it was just animals. The woods were full of them. Around midnight, I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped myself inside the sleeping bag. The nylon walls of the tent felt paper thin, like nothing at all between me and the outside. My ears stayed sharp. Every small sound pressed against me. At some point, I drifted into a shallow sleep. I woke to a noise. It was faint but sharp, not like an animal scurrying. It was deliberate. A slow crunch on leaves, then a pause, then another crunch. I lay frozen, holding my breath. My heart hammered in my chest so loud I thought it might give me away. I tried to convince myself it was a deer, maybe moving through the clearing. But the steps were careful, too slow. Deer didn't move like that. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't move at all. I stayed still for what felt like an hour, listening. Eventually, the steps faded. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe my mind had twisted a small sound into something bigger. I forced my eyes shut and stayed like that until morning light touched the tent. When I stepped outside, I checked the clearing. The grass and leaves were wet with dew, and I could see faint impressions in the ground. They weren't clear enough to tell exactly what they were, but they were long, narrow, and shaped like boot prints. My chest tightened. Someone had been there. Someone had been walking through my camp at night. I tried to push the thought away. Maybe they were old prints. Maybe a hunter had been through here days ago. Still, I couldn't shake it. I spent the day walking along the creek, gathering wood, trying to keep busy. But every time I looked back at the clearing, I thought of those prints. That night, I kept the fire going longer. I piled it high, letting the flames roar. I thought maybe the light would keep me calm. But fire draws attention too. The woods stayed silent. Too silent. I didn't hear owls. I didn't hear coyotes. Just the crackle of fire. Around 2 a.m, it happened again. The sound of leaves crushing under weight. Slow. Careful. My skin prickled all over. This time it was closer, right outside the reach of the firelight. I stayed low, crouched near the tent, staring out into the dark. My lantern was inside the tent, but I didn't dare move to grab it. I saw nothing, just shadows, but I could feel it. Someone was there, standing just out of sight, watching. I don't know how long it lasted, maybe minutes, maybe longer. Then the steps backed away, slow, deliberate. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning came, I searched again. On the edge of the clearing, the ground showed a clearer shape. A boot print, large, deep, fresh. My stomach sank. This wasn't in my head. Someone was out there circling my camp. I thought about packing up and leaving, but part of me resisted. I told myself maybe it was just someone passing through, maybe a lost hiker. If I left in a panic, I'd look foolish, so I stayed. I wish I hadn't. The third night was worse. I kept the fire small, not wanting it to draw attention. I sat in the dark, only the faint glow of embers. My ears picked up every single shift in the woods. I sat with my knife in my hand, gripping the handle until my fingers ached. The steps came earlier this time. Not at 2, but closer to midnight. I heard them circling, moving slower than before. They came close, then pulled back, then close again. I felt trapped, like prey being tested. My skin felt too tight. My mouth was dry. At one point, I swore I saw movement between the trees. A pale shape, the faintest outline of a shoulder or arm. It was gone as soon as I focused, slipping back into the black. I didn't sleep at all. I stayed awake until the first gray of dawn. When light finally came, I made a choice. I had to leave. I packed quickly, shoving gear into my pack with shaking hands. I didn't eat. I didn't boil water. I just tore everything down. As I folded the tent, I glanced at the edge of the clearing. That's when I saw it. On a tree, low to the ground, was a mark, carved into the bark. A simple line, jagged, fresh. Not nature, not accident. Someone had cut into that tree during the night. I felt ice run through me. I threw the last of my gear into the pack. swung it onto my shoulders, and started down the trail fast. The woods felt different now. Every tree looked like it hid something behind it. Every sound made me snap my head. I didn't stop to rest. I didn't stop for water. I just pushed forward. Halfway back, I noticed something that made me stop cold. On the side of the trail, pressed into the mud, was another boot print. Facing the way I was coming from, someone had been on that trail, waiting. I forced myself to keep moving. I wanted to run, but the weight of the pack slowed me. My lungs burned. My legs ached. The trail twisted, climbed, and dipped, and every turn felt like it might reveal someone standing there. The last mile stretched forever. I could almost feel eyes on my back the whole way. My skin crawled. My nerves screamed. I kept looking over my shoulder, but nothing was there. Just trees, shadows, endless woods. When I finally saw my car through the trees, I almost broke into a sprint. I reached it, threw my pack inside, and slammed the door. My hands shook as I started the engine. Gravel sprayed behind me as I tore out of the pull-off and onto the road. Only when I had driven miles away did I start to breathe normal again. My body ached from tension, my chest felt hollow, and my throat was raw. I never went back for the rest of that season. I never went back the next year either. In fact, I haven't camped alone again at all. What scared me wasn't just the thought of someone being out there. It was how patient they were. How careful. They didn't rush in. They didn't speak. They just watched. They waited. I don't know what their plan was. I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed another night. But I know one thing for certain. I wasn't alone out there. Someone followed me. Someone circled my camp. Someone marked the trees, and they wanted me to know it. I had camped many times before, and I always thought I understood the woods. I thought I knew what silence sounded like, what darkness looked like, and what it meant to be far from everything familiar. But that trip changed the way I looked at the forest forever. I had gone out to clear my head, to be away from the noise of my daily life, away from people, away from the constant rush. I picked a random spot on the map, not even a real campsite, just a patch of state forest that stretched far out and wasn't marked with many trails. That was the appeal to me. The idea that I could walk deep enough in where I wouldn't hear cars or voices or anything made by humans, just the earth and the night and myself. I packed light, just enough for 2 nights. My tent was small, my pack carried some food, a small stove, extra clothes, and the usual things you'd expect. I carried a knife at my side and had a small hatchet strapped to the outside of my pack for firewood. I started the hike in the late morning, cutting through a poorly kept trail that quickly narrowed into brush. I liked the way the air smelled there, the damp earth, the mix of pine and rotting leaves, and the way light broke through the trees in narrow beams. The deeper I went, the less sound there seemed to be. No cars, no planes, just my boots pressing against the dirt and the weight of my breathing. After a few hours, I found a clearing. It wasn't wide open, just a small patch of ground with less undergrowth, almost as if deer had passed through and worn it down over time. It was far enough from the trail that I knew no one would stumble across it. That was exactly what I wanted, to be alone, unreachable. I dropped my pack, stretched out my shoulders, and set up my small tent. I gathered fallen branches and cut some wood, stacking it neatly. By late afternoon, I had a fire pit built with rocks I had gathered from the edge of the clearing. The first night came easy. I cooked a simple meal, sat by the fire, and let my eyes adjust to the darkness beyond it. The fire made the trees look like they were alive, their shadows shifting like tall figures swaying. I knew it was only the flames playing tricks, so I tried not to focus on it. Instead, I listened. The forest had its own voice, soft cracks of branches, the quick steps of small animals in the underbrush, the distant call of something larger. None of it bothered me. I'd camped enough times to know the difference between normal forest sounds and something out of place. But that night, something did feel different. It wasn't loud. In fact, it was the opposite. It was how quiet everything got after a while. The kind of quiet that doesn't belong in the woods. I sat by the fire, waiting for an owl or some crickets or even the wind, but all I could hear was the crack of the fire and my own movements. I stared out into the tree line, the firelight making it hard to see past the first few layers of trees. I told myself it was fine, that sometimes the woods go quiet. Maybe a larger predator was moving through and the smaller animals were staying hidden. That made sense, and I used that thought to crawl into my tent. I zipped it up, laid down on my sleeping bag, and let the fire burn itself low outside. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. I just opened my eyes and lay there listening. Then I realized what had pulled me from sleep. There were footsteps outside my tent. Slow, heavy steps. Not the sound of a raccoon or a fox, not the fast scurrying of something small. These were deliberate, paced, almost careful. They pressed down into the earth like someone walking slowly around the clearing. I froze. I didn't move, didn't breathe heavy, just kept still. The steps circled once, maybe twice, and then stopped. I lay awake for hours, staring at the thin fabric of the tent, waiting to see if a shadow crossed against the dim light of the moon. Nothing came. Eventually, exhaustion dragged me back down and I slept again. When I woke up in the morning, the fire had long gone out. The air was damp and cold, and everything outside looked untouched. I stepped out and walked the clearing, scanning the dirt for prints. I saw nothing clear, just the soft marks of leaves that had fallen overnight. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it had been a deer. Maybe it was just my brain waking in the middle of the night and confusing sounds. That was what I told myself. I spent the day exploring further into the woods. I followed a narrow game trail that twisted and faded in and out. I carried my knife, more for comfort than need, and tried to enjoy the solitude. But as the day went on, I couldn't shake the unease from the night before. I kept glancing behind me, scanning the trees for movement. Every so often I thought I heard something faint, like the sound of branches bending under weight. But every time I turned, there was nothing there. By the time I made it back to camp, the sun was already dipping. I made another fire, cooked, and sat again watching the woods. My stomach stayed tight, my nerves sharp. When darkness settled, I built the fire bigger, feeding it more wood than I usually would. I told myself it was just for comfort, but the truth was I wanted as much light as possible to push back the tree line. That night, the steps came back. This time I was wide awake when I heard them, slow, steady, circling the clearing again. I gripped my knife inside the tent and tried to steady my breathing. The steps came closer than before, stopping right outside my tent just a few feet from where I lay. I could hear the press of weight against the leaves, the shift of balance. Whoever or whatever it was stood there for a long time. Too long. My arm ached from holding still. My heart thudded so loud I was sure it could be heard outside. Then after what felt like forever, the steps moved away. They didn't run, they didn't stumble, they just faded back into the woods as if whoever was out there had all the time in the world. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat up in the tent, knife in hand, waiting for something to happen. When daylight came, I stumbled out, exhausted. I searched again for tracks, for any sign someone had been there, but the ground gave me nothing. I thought about leaving right then, packing everything and hiking back, but something in me fought against it. Maybe pride, maybe stubbornness. I told myself one more night, that was all, and then I'd go home. The last day dragged. I stayed close to camp, gathering wood, sharpening sticks just to keep my hands busy. Anything to distract myself from the creeping feeling of being watched. I barely ate. My eyes stayed locked on the tree line. When night came, I built the fire even bigger than before, piling wood so high it threw sparks into the air. I sat beside it with my knife resting on my knee, my hatchet within reach. Hours passed. The night grew colder. The woods stayed quiet. Then just past midnight, I saw movement. Not imagined, not guessed, but real movement just beyond the firelight. A shape between the trees, tall, shifting slightly as it stood watching. My stomach dropped. My hands went clammy. I couldn't see a face, couldn't make out details, just the outline of a person. They didn't move closer, didn't call out, didn't do anything but stand there. I stared back, firelight cracking between us, until finally the shape turned and slipped deeper into the woods. That was enough. I knew I couldn't last another night. I fed the fire one last time, shoved my gear into my pack, and waited for the first signs of dawn. The moment I could see the faintest gray in the sky, I broke camp and started back fast. My legs carried me quicker than I thought possible, my eyes scanning constantly behind me. Every sound made me twitch. Every broken branch felt like footsteps. When I finally reached the edge of the forest and stepped onto the dirt road where my car was parked, I didn't stop until I was inside, doors locked, engine running. My hand shook so bad I could barely turn the key. I never saw who it was. I never knew why they circled my camp, why they stood there in the trees watching me. But I knew for certain it wasn't my imagination. It wasn't an animal. It was someone, a stranger deep in the woods with me, moving slowly, deliberately, like they had some plan I wasn't supposed to know about. I drove away and didn't look back. But the memory of those steps outside my tent, the weight of someone standing only a few feet away while I lay helpless inside, has never left me. I haven't camped alone since because the truth is I wasn't alone out there. And whoever was with me wanted me to know it. I always thought camping alone in the woods was about freedom. I liked the idea of not hearing cars, not having cell service, not having people walking by me all the time. I liked being cut off. But when I think back to that trip, I don't think about freedom. I think about how small I felt out there, how exposed. I think about how close I came to not walking out alive. I picked a random spot to camp that summer. I didn't want a campground or a marked trail. I wanted quiet. I studied maps and found a patch of forest in the northern part of the state that didn't seem to get much traffic. I parked my truck on a dirt road that cut through the tree line, stuffed my pack with everything I thought I'd need, and hiked until the branches closed me in on all sides. The ground dipped, then rose, then flattened out into a clearing where the grass grew taller than my knees. It felt like the kind of place no one had touched in years. That was exactly what I wanted. By late afternoon, I had my tent pitched near a tree line, with the clearing opening in front of me like a bowl. The sun dropped in slow pieces, sliding through the leaves until the light was striped across the ground. The air was heavy with the smell of damp dirt and pine. I set up a small fire pit, boiled water, and ate out of a metal pan. It was perfect quiet, no voices, no hum of traffic, only the occasional thump of something small moving in the brush. I remember feeling proud that I wasn't scared. I thought of the people who camped in RVs, or those who needed a row of bathrooms nearby. I thought about how they'd never understand what it felt like to be swallowed up by nature like this. I stretched out on my sleeping bag that night with my headlamp turned low, and told myself I was exactly where I was supposed to be. But the woods change when the light is gone. The night came in thick and fast, darker than anything you see near towns or highways. The stars were sharp above me, but the tree line was only a wall of black. Every noise stretched longer. Branches cracked like they were snapping just feet away. Leaves hissed as though something was moving slow through them. I kept telling myself it was deer or rabbits, maybe even a raccoon, but my body was tight with nerves. Every muscle waited for something to step out where I could see it. At some point I must have dozed off because I woke up in the middle of the night with my heart hammering. There was no sound of movement, only silence so deep that it felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. My mouth was dry. I thought maybe I had been dreaming, but then I noticed something. The faint smell of smoke. Not from my fire. I had put that out completely before crawling into the tent. This was fresh, thin, almost sour. I unzipped the tent as slowly as I could and stuck my head out. The clearing lay still under the stars. My fire pit was nothing but gray ash. But off to the right, past the tree line, I saw the glow. A faint orange flicker, like light leaking through the branches. It wasn't a forest fire. The glow didn't spread or rise. It stayed low, steady, as if someone else had made a fire not too far from where I was. That shouldn't have been possible. There weren't supposed to be other people out here. I told myself it was fine, maybe just another camper I hadn't noticed on the way in. The woods were big enough for more than one person. I lay back down, but I couldn't shake the thought. If it was another camper, why had I not heard them before? No footsteps, no voices, nothing until that glow. I tried to push it from my mind, but my ears wouldn't rest. I stayed awake, listening. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped, then another. They weren't sharp cracks like a deer bolting, more like careful breaks as if weight was shifting slow across the ground. The noises came closer, then stopped, then came again. My chest ached with the effort of staying still. I don't remember when I fell asleep again, only that when I woke the sun was already up and the forest seemed normal. Birds called from the trees. A squirrel darted across the clearing. I convinced myself I had made it all bigger in my head than it really was. I told myself I'd hike farther out and see if there was someone else camped nearby. If there was, I'd keep my distance. No harm done. I stuffed a day pack with water, a small knife, and a protein bar, then walked toward where I'd seen the glow the night before. The trees grew thick fast, branches clutching at my clothes. The ground dipped and rose in uneven humps, soft with moss and leaves. I walked for maybe half a mile before I found it. A fire pit. The ashes still dark, faint smoke curling from the center. Someone had been here, but the camp itself was strange. No tent, no tarp, just the remains of a fire. A circle of rocks pulled into place, and beside it a log that looked like it had been dragged for sitting. But no bag, no gear, nothing to suggest anyone had actually camped there. The strangest thing was the bones, small ones scattered around the ashes. Too big to be from fish, too small for deer. Some still had dark patches clinging to them. They looked boiled, stripped clean, and tossed aside. My skin crawled as I stared at them. I turned back toward my clearing, moving fast. The woods didn't feel the same anymore. Every step made me feel like eyes were watching from behind the trees. The rest of that day I stayed close to my camp. I kept the fire small. I kept my knife on me even when I went to fill water from the creek. The air had changed. It was heavier, like the forest itself was pressing in. The quiet was different too. It wasn't peaceful anymore, it was expectant. That night I barely slept. I lay in the tent listening, my headlamp gripped tight in my hand. Sometime around midnight the noises started again. Slow cracks of wood, rustling leaves. This time they circled. One moment the sound came from the left side of my tent. Then it shifted behind me, then to the right. I didn't hear footsteps, only the weight of movement pressing against the forest floor. I stayed still until I thought my lungs would burst. Then something touched the tent. Just a brush. The fabric shifted inward near my feet. Not a gust of wind, not a falling branch. Something was there, standing close enough to press against the nylon. I bolted upright, unzipped the flap, and shined my headlamp into the clearing. The beam swung across the grass and trees, nothing, only the emptiness staring back. My fire had burned low, giving off nothing but weak orange coals. I thought I saw movement at the tree line, a shadow ducking back, but I couldn't be sure. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat with the knife across my knees until the sun dragged itself up. The next morning I told myself I'd had enough. I packed fast, my hands shaking as I shoved gear into the bag. I wanted out, but the woods weren't done with me yet. On the way back to where I'd left my truck, I saw them. Boot prints, deep in the dirt, fresh. They weren't mine. They were larger, wider, and they followed the same path I had taken in. My stomach turned cold. Whoever had made that fire, whoever had circled my tent, they had been close enough to see me, close enough to follow. The prints veered off after a while, deeper into the woods. I didn't wait to find out where they led. I pushed harder, almost running, until the trees thinned and the road appeared. My truck sat alone in the dirt, sun baking the metal. Relief hit me so hard I almost dropped to my knees, but then I saw it. On the hood of the truck, pressed into the dust, was a handprint. Big, broad, the fingers spread wide. Someone had been here, waiting, maybe watching to see if I'd come back. I climbed in, locked the doors, and drove until the road turned to pavement and the forest fell away behind me. I never reported it. I told myself it was pointless, that no one would believe me, that there wasn't enough proof. But I know what I felt out there. I know what I saw. Someone else had been in those woods with me, not another camper, not someone passing through. Someone who watched, someone who waited. I haven't camped alone since. And every time I think about that night, I wonder how close they got, how long they stood in the dark, only feet from me, while I lay inside my tent pretending I was safe. I packed for the trip with the idea that I wanted to get away from everything for a few days. Work had been dragging me down. Noise in the city felt endless, and the thought of breathing cold forest air seemed like the only thing that would make my head clear. I picked a spot far enough from the usual campsites that I wouldn't have to deal with people crowding around, but not so deep that I couldn't hike back out in a day if something went wrong. I studied maps for weeks and marked the route carefully. The trail wasn't marked on the usual brochures or guide apps, but I had found it online in an old hiker's forum. According to the comments, it was a forgotten fire road that cut into the hills, barely used anymore except by hunters and the occasional backpacker. It was the kind of trail where you had to push through brush and fallen trees, where you could walk for hours without seeing another person. That was exactly what I wanted: solitude, quiet, the kind that wasn't possible anywhere else. The morning I left, I had a pack loaded with the usual: tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, water filter, first aid kit, and enough food to last. The weather was perfect. Late fall air, just cold enough to sting when I stopped moving, but warm when the sun hit my back. I parked my truck near the old service gate and walked in, brushing past the rusted sign that warned about maintenance beyond that point. The dirt road was half-eaten by weeds, leaves crushed under my boots with every step. For the first few miles, everything was as peaceful as I hoped. Squirrels scattered across the ground, and I saw a few deer far off between the trees. The forest was quiet, and I could hear the rhythm of my own breath. Hours passed like that, with only the crunch of my boots and the wind moving through the branches above me. By the time I picked my campsite, the sun was already sliding behind the ridge. I found a clearing tucked away from the road where the ground was flat and soft enough for the tent. I set everything up with the usual rhythm: tent first, sleeping bag rolled out, stove balanced on a flat rock for cooking. The air turned colder quickly once the sun was gone, so I boiled water and ate a quick meal while the sky went black. It was the kind of night where the forest seemed endless. No glow of cities, no headlights, not even the faintest hum of a road, just darkness that seemed to press in around the edges of the firelight. The only sounds were the popping of the small fire and the far-off call of some bird settling in. I thought it would make me feel calm, but instead I noticed how my shoulders stayed tense. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, as if the woods were holding their breath. When I finally turned off my headlamp and lay down in the tent, the stillness made every little noise sharp. Twigs snapping, leaves shifting, the faint scrape of something moving in the distance. I told myself it was just animals, raccoons or deer, nothing unusual. But I stayed awake longer than I expected, staring at the nylon ceiling of the tent, listening for anything out of place. At some point I must have drifted off, but the sound that woke me was different. Not the random scurry of an animal, but a distinct crunch. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the leaves not far from where I was lying. My heart began to hammer so hard I could hear it in my ears. I held still, every muscle locked, straining to hear. The steps came closer, paused, then shifted again. I waited, counting each sound, trying to match it to some explanation. A bear may be moving heavy through the brush, but the spacing of the steps wasn't 4 legs, it was 2. Someone was walking near my camp. I froze, hardly breathing, hoping the sound would fade away. After what felt like forever, it did. The footsteps drifted off into the distance, swallowed by the forest. I stayed awake until dawn. Every time I started to relax, some small sound would jolt me back up, thinking whoever or whatever had been there might return. When the first light finally touched the trees, I climbed out of the tent, stiff from the cold and from staying frozen in one position. The ground around the clearing looked normal at first, but when I circled out a little farther, I saw impressions in the damp leaves. Shoe prints. Not boots like mine, but lighter, smaller, with a flat tread. They circled just beyond the glow of where my fire had been. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe another hiker who happened to pass by at night, though I knew how unlikely that was. The trail was barely used, and what kind of person walks through the woods in the dark without a light? I thought about packing up right then and leaving, but pride or stubbornness kept me from it. I had wanted solitude, and this was part of it, I told myself. Strange noises in the woods were just part of camping alone. I forced myself to go about the day, hiking farther down the road, exploring, filtering water from a stream. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. Every time I stopped, I found myself scanning the trees, waiting for movement. I started noticing small things that unsettled me. A branch bent down in the wrong direction, as if someone had grabbed it while moving past. A fresh scrape on a tree trunk at shoulder height, too high for a deer. At one point I thought I caught a flicker of movement far back in the trees, but when I blinked it was gone. That night, I built a bigger fire and sat with my back against a tree, facing the woods. I didn't crawl into the tent until exhaustion forced me to. Sleep came in pieces, shallow and restless. At some point I opened my eyes and realized the fire had gone out. The forest was black and silent again, and as soon as I noticed the silence I heard it. Footsteps. They were closer this time. Slow, careful, moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. My chest tightened and I gripped the knife I kept in my pack. The steps circled, pausing now and then starting again. They didn't retreat into the distance like before. They stayed close, moving around me in a wide arc, as if someone was studying the camp. I couldn't bring myself to move. I lay there in the dark, knife clutched in my hand, every nerve on fire. After what felt like hours, the steps stopped. I didn't hear them fade this time, they just ended. Like whoever it was had gone still and was waiting. I don't remember falling asleep, but when daylight came, I stumbled out of the tent with my mouth dry and my legs shaking. Again, there were tracks, clear this time in the soft dirt near where I had stacked wood. They weren't mine. They circled the camp and stopped just a few feet from the tent. Whoever it was had stood there for a while, close enough to reach out and touch the fabric. I packed up fast, shoving everything into my bag without the usual care. My plan had been to stay 3 nights, but now all I wanted was to get back to the truck. The hike out felt twice as long as the hike in. Every sound behind me made me whip around, expecting to see someone there. I never did, but the feeling didn't go away. When I finally reached the gate and saw my truck waiting, I felt my chest loosen for the first time in 2 days. But even then, when I looked back at the trailhead, I thought I saw something just inside the tree line, a figure standing still, half hidden in the shadows. I didn't stay long enough to be sure. I climbed into the truck, started the engine, and drove until the forest was far behind me. I never went back to that place. I don't think I ever will. Even now, when I camp, I pick spots where I know other people will be nearby. I tell myself it's safer, but the truth is I can't stand the silence anymore. Because when the woods go quiet, I hear those footsteps again in my head, circling just out of sight, waiting for me to lie down and close my eyes. I had camped many times before, but something about that trip felt different from the start. It was one of those trips I planned without much thought. Just a quick decision to head into the woods for a weekend, away from noise and people. I didn't choose any famous campground. I just drove until the road narrowed, the trees got thicker, and the asphalt gave way to dirt. I had packed light, just a tent, a small sleeping bag, a cooler with some food, and the basics I thought I'd need. I wasn't worried. I had done it enough times to know how to manage alone in the woods. I parked my car off the dirt road and carried my gear deeper into the trees. I wanted to be away from where anyone might come across me. The air smelled heavy, like damp earth and pine, and I could hear the faint sound of a stream somewhere downhill. The place felt empty, almost too quiet. Usually when I camp, I hear birds calling, branches snapping under animals, or at least the rustle of wind through the trees. That day, the silence sat heavy all around me. It wasn't peaceful silence either. It was the kind of silence that made you look over your shoulder more often than you needed to. I chose a flat spot between a cluster of tall pines. The ground was soft, covered in needles and damp soil. I set up my tent, staked it down, and built a small fire pit with some rocks I collected nearby. My cooler went into the shade so the ice would last. I checked my phone out of habit, though I had no signal. That didn't bother me much. Part of the point of camping was to get away from screens. Still, when I saw no service at the top of the screen, I felt more cut off than usual. By the time the sun started lowering, I had the fire going and some food cooking on a pan I set over it. The orange glow of the flames flickered across the trees and the shadows stretched and bent in strange ways. I sat there, chewing slowly, listening to the wood pop and crackle. The stream downhill was the only sound that broke the stillness. The silence was unnatural for a forest. I remember noticing that and telling myself maybe it was just the season, or maybe the animals weren't as active here. As night fully came down, I added more wood to the fire. The temperature dropped quicker than I expected. I put on my jacket and sat closer to the heat. The trees beyond the firelight turned into black walls, and the glow only reached a few feet into them. I felt boxed in, the woods pressing close. The flames danced, and every now and then I thought I saw a movement in the dark. But it was just shadow shifting when the fire leaned one way or another. At least that's what I told myself. When I finally crawled into my tent, the fire had burned low. I zipped myself into the sleeping bag and lay still, listening. It's strange how much louder things seem when you're lying in the dark, trying to sleep. The sound of the stream seemed louder. The faint crack of a branch somewhere far off made my eyes snap open. I told myself it was animals. That's normal. Deer, raccoons, anything. But the longer I lay awake, the more I realized the noises weren't random. There was a rhythm to them. Cracks, then silence, then a few more steps, then silence again. It didn't sound like the aimless moving of an animal. It sounded deliberate, like something or someone was pacing itself through the trees. Stopping when I might have been listening, then moving again. I lay there, eyes wide open in the dark, not daring to breathe too loud. I thought about reaching for the flashlight I had next to me, but I didn't. I didn't want to shine light outside and see something staring back. My heart thudded in my chest so hard it almost hurt. For hours I heard those small, careful movements circling, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. I knew I wasn't imagining it. I stayed still, clutching the sleeping bag tight around me until exhaustion finally pulled me under. When morning came, I stepped out of the tent stiff and groggy. The fire pit was just gray ash now. Sunlight pushed through the canopy in thin streaks. I looked around the camp, scanning the ground. That's when I noticed them, footprints. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet. The prints were faint in the damp earth, but clear enough. They circled my camp close to the tent. Close enough that whoever it was had stood within a few feet of me while I was inside. The size was off too. They weren't small like a child's, but they weren't large like a grown man's. Narrow, long, strange. I felt my stomach twist. I tried to calm myself, telling myself maybe someone had passed by. But the tracks didn't just pass, they lingered, circled, doubled back. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I convinced myself it wasn't necessary. People wander the woods. Maybe it was just someone curious, someone passing. That's what I told myself, even though I didn't believe it. Instead of leaving, I decided to stay another night, but move my tent a little farther downhill, closer to the stream. Maybe being near water would drown out the noises and help me sleep. I cooked a small breakfast, forced myself to eat, then spent most of the day walking the area, trying to get a sense of who else might be around. I found no other campsites, no people, nothing. Just empty woods. As the sun dipped again, the nervousness returned. The firelight felt weaker than before, the trees darker. I stayed up longer this time, tossing more wood into the flames, staring into the shadows beyond. At one point I thought I saw something between the trees. Not movement this time, something standing. I squinted hard, trying to focus, but the darkness swallowed it. My eyes watered from staring, and when I blinked, it was gone. The silence pressed heavier than ever. I put the fire out early and got into the tent, hoping if I laid low and quiet, nothing would come near. But it did. The sound started again not long after midnight. The same pattern, steps, pauses, steps again. Only this time they didn't just circle, they came closer. The crunch of leaves was right outside the tent. I could hear breathing now, slow, steady breathing just feet away from me. My skin went cold. Every hair on my body stood on end. I held my breath, waiting. The breathing stayed for what felt like forever, then moved away slowly. I didn't sleep at all after that. When dawn came, I got out of the tent with shaking hands. My cooler had been opened, the lid tilted, and some of the food was missing. What made my blood run cold was how it was taken. The lid hadn't been ripped off like an animal would. It had been lifted clean, set down, and food picked out. That's when it hit me. I wasn't dealing with animals at all. Someone was out there, barefoot, creeping around my camp, opening my things while I slept. I didn't waste time that morning. I packed everything as fast as I could, throwing it all into my backpack, collapsing the tent without care. I wanted out of those woods. My heart hammered the whole time. As I hoisted the pack and started back uphill toward where my car was, I kept turning around, scanning the trees. I didn't see anyone, but I knew I was being watched. The feeling clung to me, heavy and real. Every step I took, I expected to hear steps behind me. When I reached the dirt road, my car sat there untouched. Relief hit me hard, but it didn't last. On the hood of the car, smeared in what looked like mud, were 2 handprints. Long, narrow handprints streaked down the metal as if someone had stood there, leaning over. Watching the empty road, I froze, staring at them, my throat dry. The prints weren't old either. They were damp, fresh, the mud still wet enough that it hadn't dried under the morning sun. I yanked open the door, tossed my gear in, and got inside. I locked the doors, started the engine, and sped off without looking back. My hands shook the whole drive until I finally hit the main road again. Even then, I didn't stop. I didn't stop until I was back in town, surrounded by people, by noise, by life again. That was the last time I ever camped alone. I had camped many times before, and I always thought I understood what it meant to be alone in the woods. I thought I knew the difference between harmless night sounds and real danger. I thought I was careful enough, prepared enough, smart enough not to end up in the kind of situation that leaves a person broken, sleepless, and forever looking over their shoulder. What happened on that trip taught me that I had been wrong about all of it. I went out alone that weekend, which was my first mistake. I told myself it was only for one night, just a quick trip to clear my head, nothing serious. I drove into the national forest where the old fire roads split off in a dozen directions. The air smelled like pine needles, and the dirt roads were rutted from rain and trucks, but the place felt quiet and safe in the daylight. I parked where the road narrowed, loaded my pack, and walked deeper than most people bothered going. I wanted quiet. I wanted to be away from everything. The sun was still up when I picked a flat spot near a small creek to set my tent. The water there was shallow and slow, lined with moss and smooth stones, the kind of sound that makes you feel calm without thinking about it. I pitched the tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and stacked a small pile of wood for later. It all felt routine, something I had done many times. I cooked an early dinner of beans and rice on my little stove, cleaned the pot, and watched the light drain from the trees. The forest had that evening hush, the time when the last birds go quiet and the crickets begin. I sat by the creek for a long time, listening, watching the water, just trying to let my mind go blank. That was the last time during that trip I felt relaxed. When the darkness came, it came fast. I built a small fire, nothing big, just enough to see by. The flames flickered against the tree trunks, the smoke twisting straight up into the still air. The night was colder than I expected, so I sat close. I stared into the fire until my eyes watered, and every so often I turned to check the shadows behind me. At first, it was just habit, just the usual nerves of being alone. But each time I looked, the woods felt heavier, thicker, like they were pressing in closer. At some point, I heard something snap out there. Not the sharp crack of a branch falling, but the sudden, crisp break of something stepping down on wood. My whole body stiffened. I told myself it was a deer. It's always a deer, I thought. That's what everyone says. But I didn't hear any more steps after that. Nothing moved. The crickets even seemed to stop for a second. I sat there listening so hard that my own heartbeat felt like it filled my ears. After a while, I forced myself to climb into the tent. I zipped it closed, turned off the lantern, and laid down in my sleeping bag. The nylon walls of the tent felt so thin, like tissue paper stretched between me and the night. Every sound outside was sharper. The creek gurgling, the leaves shifting in the breeze, the distant knock of wood against wood. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but my chest was tight, and I couldn't let go enough to sleep. I must have drifted in and out, because the next thing I knew, I was awake again, staring into the dark with the weight of silence pressing down. It wasn't full silence. There was something outside, faint but steady, a soft crunch, then another. It was the sound of someone or something walking slowly on the damp ground. The steps were deliberate, not quick, not clumsy. They circled wide, moving through the trees, always just far enough away that I couldn't tell how big, how close. I lay flat, holding my breath, trying not to make a single sound. My ears strained for every detail. The footsteps would pause, then start again. At one point, I was sure they stopped right behind the tent. I could almost feel the weight of a presence just on the other side of that thin nylon wall. My hand shook as I reached slowly for the knife I kept by my sleeping bag. My skin felt like it was buzzing. My stomach knotted so tight I thought I might vomit. Eventually, the steps faded, but I didn't move. I stayed frozen in place, waiting, listening. Minutes stretched like hours. My eyes burned from keeping them open, staring into the black. I told myself that maybe it had been an animal, maybe a coyote or even a bear. But the way those steps moved, slow, careful, circling, didn't fit. Wild animals don't walk like that. I never really slept. The night dragged on forever. Every time my body started to relax, I would jolt awake again at the slightest sound. By the time the first gray light started filtering through the trees, my mouth was dry, and my whole body ached from tensing up. In the daylight, it was almost easy to laugh it off. The woods looked harmless again, bright and calm. I stepped out of the tent and walked around, checking the ground. At first, I didn't see much. Then I noticed a patch of dirt by the creek where the moss was scraped back. There were marks there, faint but clear enough to see. Not hooves, not paws, shoes, human shoes. The print wasn't sharp enough to tell size, but it was definitely the flat sole of a boot or sneaker. The step was angled toward my camp. My stomach dropped and my skin prickled even though the sun was already warm. I packed fast. I didn't even bother cooking breakfast. I shoved everything into my pack, tore down the tent, and got ready to leave. I kept glancing into the trees, half expecting someone to step out at any second. Nothing did. The hike back felt longer than before. Every few minutes I thought I heard something behind me, but when I stopped to listen, the forest was still. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the back of my neck stayed tight the whole walk. When I reached my car, the first thing I did was check it. Everything looked fine at first. Then I saw it, the smear of mud across the back window. A handprint. Not huge, not small, just a human hand dragged across the glass. The mud was fresh. I stood there staring at it, my whole body trembling. The car had been locked and nothing inside was touched, but the message was clear. Someone had been there. Someone had been watching. I got in, locked the doors, and drove without stopping until I hit the main road. My hands shook so bad on the wheel I had to pull over once just to steady myself. I didn't tell anyone the full story when I got home. I just said I cut the trip short. But the truth is, I know I wasn't alone out there. Someone followed me into those woods. Someone circled my camp in the dark while I lay there helpless, listening. Someone touched my car just to let me know they had been close. That night replayed in my head for months. Even now, years later, I can't sleep in a tent without waking up at every little sound. I stopped camping alone completely. I keep the knife closer than ever, even in my own house, because once you realize how thin the walls are between safety and danger, once you've felt a stranger's presence breathing just outside your reach, you never forget it, and I know this much. If I hadn't packed up that morning, if I had stayed another night, I might not be here writing this now. I never thought camping alone in the woods could change the way I see the world, but that trip did. I wasn't going far from home. I wanted something simple, something quiet, just a couple of days away from work, noise, and people. I picked a spot I found online. It wasn't an official campsite with picnic tables or marked trails. It was just land out there, open to anyone who knew where to walk. I left my car off a dirt road where it dipped between some trees. I figured no one would come down that way since it was overgrown and rough. I packed light but enough to last. Tent, sleeping bag, food sealed tight, water jugs, a little gas stove. I had a small hatchet, a folding knife, and a flashlight with extra batteries. Everything seemed fine, normal. I remember locking my car, throwing my backpack over my shoulder, and feeling the quiet. The only sound was the crunch of my boots and the shifting of my gear. I walked for maybe an hour, long enough to sweat through my shirt. The trees were thick, but I liked it that way. I didn't want wide open space. I wanted the woods to close around me so I could disappear into them. When I reached a little clearing near a shallow creek, I decided that was it. The ground was mostly level. There were some old fire rings, blackened stones where other people had camped before. That made me feel better. It meant I wasn't the only one who'd picked that spot before. I set up the tent, rolled out the bag inside, and stacked my food up in a sealed bin. I thought about hanging it, but I told myself I'd do it later. I was tired from the walk and more focused on drinking water than worrying about animals. The first few hours were perfect. I walked down the creek a little, skipped a few stones, and just listened. It was all the little noises people forget exist when they're inside. The crackle of leaves, the low sound of water moving over rocks, the birds calling to each other from branches. The longer I sat there, the more my brain slowed down. When the sun dipped low, I cooked a quick meal on the stove. The light through the trees was sharp and gold, and then it was gone. Darkness dropped fast. I got the fire going in the old ring. The wood was damp at first, but once it caught, it burned steady. I sat close, poking it with a stick, just staring into it. It was quiet until I heard something. At first, I thought it was just the fire popping. Then I realized it wasn't. It was out in the trees, somewhere past the edge of the light. A branch snapped. Not a small twig, but something heavier. I froze and listened. It didn't happen again. I figured it was an animal. A deer maybe, or raccoon. The woods are full of them. I didn't like the thought of a bear, but the area wasn't really known for that. I told myself not to overthink it. Still, I kept glancing into the dark, into the places where the firelight faded out and turned the trees into shapes. I never saw anything move. Eventually, I put the fire out with water, stirred the ashes until nothing glowed, and went inside the tent. The ground felt hard under me, but I managed to get comfortable. The fabric of the tent rustled when I shifted. Outside, the night was full of sound. Crickets, distant owls, the steady trickle of water. It should have been peaceful, but I lay awake longer than I expected. Every little sound seemed louder than it should. Every time leaves shifted, I pictured something stepping closer. I woke up in the middle of the night. No idea what time it was. The fire was cold outside, no glow through the tent. Everything was black. What woke me wasn't a dream or thirst. It was noise, footsteps, slow, uneven, moving through leaves. They weren't animal sounds. They were heavy, dragging with a rhythm. My body locked up. I listened. The steps got closer. They circled, not fast, not rushing, just moving around. Leaves and twigs snapped quietly. Like whoever it was tried not to be heard, but wasn't careful enough. My heart pounded. I didn't move, not even to unzip the sleeping bag. I just stared at the ceiling of the tent. The steps stopped right outside. I waited for something to happen, but nothing did. No hand touched the tent. No voice called out. Just silence. Then, slow as before, the steps moved away. They faded into the distance. I stayed awake until I saw the faintest light of morning push through the thin fabric. When I finally unzipped the tent, the air was damp and cold. The fire pit was wet from where I'd poured water. The food bin was where I left it. Nothing looked touched. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe some drunk hiker stumbled around and left. Or maybe it was an animal and I convinced myself it was human. But I couldn't shake the sound. I knew the difference between 4 legs in leaves and 2 legs. The day passed slow. I tried to distract myself by hiking up past the creek, climbing a little ridge. The woods were thick, branches catching my sleeves, mud grabbing my boots. By the time I got back, my clothes were damp with sweat again. That second evening, I built the fire earlier. I wanted the light before the dark closed in. I kept glancing into the trees. I ate, sat with my back against a log, and waited for night. I couldn't relax. I kept thinking about the footsteps. As the sky went black, I made myself stay awake by feeding the fire. The flames threw sparks up and smoke drifted into my eyes. Hours passed. I didn't sleep. I just sat there staring into the woods, waiting, and then it happened again. The sound came from farther out this time. Twigs breaking, slow movement. I stared hard into the dark, trying to see. My eyes played tricks. Shapes moved between the trees, but when I blinked, they were gone. The sound kept circling, same as before. Whoever it was stayed just far enough out that I couldn't see. Not an animal. Not random. I gripped the hatchet in my hand, my knuckles pale in the firelight. The circling went on for what felt like hours. Finally, nothing. Silence again. I didn't go into the tent. I stayed by the fire until morning. When daylight came, I packed everything. I couldn't stay. My nerves were shot and every part of me screamed to leave. When I reached the spot where I'd left my car, my stomach dropped. The car wasn't there. The dirt road was empty. My first thought was that I took the wrong way back, but I knew I hadn't. The trees, the bend in the path, everything matched. My car was gone. Panic set in. I dropped my gear and just stood there staring at the empty space. No tire marks fresh enough to follow. No sign of it. Just gone. That was when I noticed something else. In the dirt near where the car had been were footprints. Not boots, shoes, normal sneakers, tread worn down. More than one set, maybe two or three. They led back into the trees. I realized then I hadn't imagined the footsteps at night. Someone had been there. Someone had been watching. They waited until I was gone to take my car. I had no choice but to shoulder my pack again and start walking. The dirt road stretched on and I didn't know how far the nearest house or main road was. My throat dried out faster than I expected and the weight of the pack cut into my shoulders. Every noise behind me made me turn. Every gust of wind felt like eyes. By midday, the sun burned down and I hadn't seen a single car or person. Just woods and endless dirt. My legs ached. I stopped to drink from one of my jugs and that's when I noticed it. Another footprint. On the side of the road, pressed into the soft dirt. The same tread pattern I saw near my car. The edges were sharp, recent. I froze, scanning the trees. Nothing moved, but I felt it. I wasn't walking out alone. Hours later, exhausted, I saw something ahead. A small shape on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a dead animal. When I got closer, my stomach turned. It was my food bin from camp, lid open, contents gone. Whoever took my car had gone back, taken my things, and left this here. Like they wanted me to see it. The sun started sinking, shadows stretching long across the road. My legs shook with every step. I knew I couldn't make it much farther before dark. I didn't want to be out there again when the night closed in. Then I saw it. Off in the trees, through the branches. A flash of something shiny. Metal. I thought maybe it was a roof, a shed, something. I pushed through the brush, branches whipping my face until I stumbled into another clearing. There was no shed. No roof, just my car. Parked crooked, doors closed, sitting silent. Relief hit me, but it was tangled with fear. Why bring it here? Why not take it farther? I approached slow, every step heavy. When I reached it, I saw the doors weren't locked. I pulled the handle. The inside was empty. No keys, no gear, nothing. Just stripped bare. On the driver's seat, someone had left something. My hatchet. Clean blade pointing toward me. That was the moment I knew it wasn't random. It wasn't kids, it wasn't drifters just stealing a ride. Whoever they were, they had followed me from the start. They wanted me to know it. I didn't wait. I left the car, left the clearing, and walked until the road curved, and finally, hours later, I saw headlights. A truck slowed, the driver staring at me like I was out of my mind. He let me in, and I didn't stop shaking the whole ride back into town. I never went back for the car. I never camped alone again. Even now, years later, I still hear those footsteps at night when the house creaks or the wind moves outside my window. Not ghosts, not monsters, just people. Real people out there in the dark waiting, and that's worse than anything I could have made up. Here's a long, single-piece, first-person, realistic, scary camping story. It's written with simple, direct language, full of detail, no fantasy elements, no dialogue, and it ends with a clear, grounded conclusion. I had been planning the camping trip for weeks, trying to get away from the noise of the city and the constant routine of work. I wanted quiet, something raw and open, something that made me feel small again in a way that was good. The woods had always done that for me. I drove out alone on a Friday morning, my car packed with a tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a small stove, and the other gear I thought I might need. I had studied the map of the area enough to know the trailheads and streams, but I picked a spot far from the main campgrounds. I didn't want anyone around me. I thought solitude would be the point. The drive out was long, winding roads that cut through stretches of farmland before narrowing into gravel roads surrounded by thick tree lines. By the time I parked the car near the unmarked trail I had chosen, I already felt that sense of being cut off. No phone signal, no faint hum of traffic, just the crunch of gravel under my boots and the soft stir of the trees as the wind pushed through. The hike into the woods took me the better part of 2 hours. The path wasn't official, just faint marks in the dirt that others had walked before. The forest was heavy with pines and old oaks, their branches tangled high above to block out most of the sun. The air felt colder as I got deeper in. My pack dug into my shoulders and sweat ran down my back, but I didn't mind. It was the kind of silence I came for, broken only by my own breathing and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. When I finally found a clearing by a stream, I knew I had reached my spot. The ground was flat, soft with pine needles, and there was just enough space to set up camp. I unpacked slowly, taking my time. I staked down the tent, unrolled the sleeping bag, stacked firewood I had gathered nearby, and boiled water on my small stove. I sat by the stream, dipping my hands into the cold current, feeling that peace I thought I had been chasing. The first night was uneventful. I sat by a small fire until the stars came out. The forest came alive with crickets and the occasional, far-off rustle, but I told myself it was nothing more than animals. I lay in the tent and drifted in and out of sleep, waking now and then at the sound of something moving outside, but it was never close. It was natural. The second day I explored. I followed the stream further into the woods, climbing over rocks and ducking under branches. I saw tracks in the mud near the bank, deer for sure, maybe raccoons too. I found a patch of wild berries and I ate a few, washing them down with water from my canteen. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was low. My fire burned brighter. That night, the flames reflecting in the glossy eyes of something that watched from the darkness for a moment before disappearing into the brush. Probably a deer again, I thought. But that second night I had more trouble sleeping. I lay in my bag, listening. The forest was full of sounds, but some of them didn't fit the rhythm I had grown used to. A steady crunch of leaves that didn't come from a four-legged animal, a pause. Then another crunch. I sat up, straining to hear, but it stopped. I waited until my eyelids grew heavy again, but I never fully slept. The third day I felt uneasy. I kept looking over my shoulder when I went to fetch water or gather more wood. The forest didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like it was holding something back, keeping me distracted. When I came back to camp after wandering a little too far from the stream, I noticed something that froze me. My pack, which I had left zipped shut inside the tent, was sitting outside the entrance. Nothing was missing that I could see, but it had been moved. I told myself maybe I hadn't zipped the tent all the way, and maybe an animal had dragged it out. That seemed possible. But the neat way it had been placed outside didn't sit right with me. That night the fire burned low. I kept feeding it more wood than usual because I didn't like how the dark pressed so hard against the edges of the light. The noises returned again, the crunch of leaves in uneven steps, sometimes close, sometimes farther off. I thought about calling out, but my throat locked. I just sat, listening, waiting. When the sound stopped, I crawled inside the tent and zipped it shut. Sleep never came. Hours passed as I lay stiff in the bag, listening to every brush of the wind, every soft scrape outside. At one point I thought I heard the faint sound of breathing, not my own, right outside the thin wall of fabric. I pressed my hand against the side of the tent, and the sound stopped. I waited, holding my breath, until my chest burned. Eventually, the forest went quiet again, so quiet it didn't feel natural. When dawn came, I forced myself out. The camp looked normal. Everything in place, the fire burned down to ash, my gear where I left it. But in the dirt near the stream, just at the edge of the clearing, I saw them. Footprints. Human. Bare. The toes pressed deep into the mud as if someone had been standing there for a long time watching. They weren't mine. They pointed toward the tent. The air felt different after that. I ate a quick meal and decided I would pack up and leave before nightfall. I didn't care about finishing the trip anymore. I just wanted out. But as I broke down camp, the feeling of being watched grew heavier. I would bend to roll my sleeping bag and I would feel it, eyes on me. I would turn and the trees would be still. The hike back was worse. My legs felt weak, my pack heavier than when I came in. Every step echoed with the memory of those footprints. The woods seemed to close in tighter the further I went, and more than once I thought I heard something behind me, keeping pace. I didn't stop to look. I didn't want to see. When I finally reached the gravel road and saw my car, I almost broke into a run. I threw the pack in the back, slid into the seat and locked the doors. My hands shook as I started the engine. I sat there for a minute, staring into the tree line, waiting for something to move, but nothing did. The drive out was silent except for the hum of the engine. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone walking down the road behind me, barefoot, keeping up no matter how fast I went. But the road stayed empty. By the time I reached the highway, I thought I was in the clear. But when I stopped at a gas station an hour later to fill up, I opened the trunk to grab a drink from my pack and my stomach dropped. The pack was open. I know I hadn't unzipped it since leaving camp. Inside, everything was still there. Food, water, clothes. But tucked into the top pocket, folded carefully, was a strip of pine bark. Freshly peeled, still damp, with the shape of a bare footprint pressed into it. That was the last time I went camping alone. I had gone camping alone many times before, so when I planned another trip in late summer, I didn't think too much about it. I packed the same gear I always carried: a heavy canvas tent, my sleeping bag, a camp stove, food sealed tight in containers, a good flashlight, spare batteries, a knife, a hatchet, and my old steel water canteen. The plan was simple: hike up into the hills, set camp near a clearing I knew, spend 3 nights, then head back down. I liked being out there where no noise from cars or people could reach me, where the air smelled of pine and dirt, and the only sounds were wind in the branches and crickets after dark. The trail in was not hard, just long. I had hiked it in daylight plenty of times, but this time I started later in the morning than I should have. The heat slowed me down, and I carried a pack that felt heavier than before, even though it had all the same things. Sweat was running down my back by the time I reached the clearing, and the sun was already dipping toward late afternoon. I wanted to set the tent quickly before dark, so I chose a flat area near a line of trees. The clearing was surrounded on 3 sides by forest, tall pine and fir with thick underbrush. On the 4th side, the land sloped down into a narrow ravine that carried water after rain. Now it was mostly dry except for a trickle that glistened under the light. It was a good spot, with just enough open space to feel safe but enough cover to block some wind. I set the tent, staked it down, unrolled the bag, and laid my gear in neat piles. I boiled water, made a simple meal, and ate while the air cooled. The woods grew quiet except for insects. That first night was uneventful. I lay in my bag, listening to the branches creak, the occasional crack of some animal moving in the underbrush, and then finally I drifted off. The second day, I woke early, stretched and brewed coffee on the little stove. I spent most of the morning wandering through the woods, not straying too far from camp. I found deer tracks in soft earth, saw a hawk wheel high overhead, and once startled a rabbit that darted into a bush before I even registered it was there. The peace of it all made me slow down, breathe easier. I cooked lunch back at camp, read from a paperback I had stuffed into the pack, then stretched out in the shade. But sometime in the afternoon, I had the first feeling that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't a sound at first, more the lack of it. Birds that had been chirping and flitting around in the trees all morning were suddenly quiet. The woods seemed to hold its breath. I stood scanning the trees, listening hard. For a long moment, nothing. Then I heard it, a faint crunch like a foot on dry leaves, far off but distinct. I froze. It came again, slower this time, from the direction of the trees on the north side. My mind went straight to the thought of deer, maybe even a bear. I clutched the hatchet I had left leaned against the tent. My eyes searched the tree line, but the shadows there were deep and I saw nothing. After a minute, the sound stopped. I waited, standing in silence, the sun hot on my face, sweat running down into my eyes. Nothing else came. Finally, I convinced myself it had just been a deer moving through, and I sat back down. But the quiet stayed for a long time before the woods slowly filled again with bird calls and insect hum. That night, I built a fire. It was small, enough to give light and a little heat. I sat by it after dinner, staring at the flames, listening. The woods felt closer than usual. When the fire burned low, I doused it with water, stirred the ash, and made sure it was cold before going into the tent. Sleep came uneasy. I woke several times, half alert, ears straining at small noises. Once I thought I heard something brushing against the outside of the tent, faint but real. My hand tightened on the knife lying near my bag. I held still, barely breathing. After a long time, when nothing else came, I told myself it was branches shifting in the wind, but the trees outside had not been moving. By the third day, I was restless. I hiked further, tried to shake the unease. The forest was beautiful, sunlight cutting through in beams, the smell of warm earth, the sound of a woodpecker tapping. But I couldn't stop glancing behind me, scanning the ground for prints. At one point, I found a scuffed mark in the dirt near the ravine. It looked like a heel. I crouched low, studying it. The edge of the impression was sharp, not weathered, not old. It had been made recently. I didn't like that. I was miles from the nearest trailhead. Nobody should be up here. I told myself maybe it was my own track from before, but my boots left a different pattern. This one was smoother, more worn down, like a shoe that had walked many miles. That night, I skipped the fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I ate cold food in silence and went into the tent early, knife at hand, flashlight beside me. Darkness wrapped the clearing thick and heavy. Sometime past midnight, I woke to a sound that set every nerve in me on edge. It was soft at first, almost nothing, but steady, like the drag of fabric over grass. I held still, my heart thudding, straining to hear. Then came the crunch of a footstep. Close, too close, right outside the tent wall. I gripped the knife, slow and silent, sweat already slick in my palm. Another step, circling. The nylon wall of the tent was thin. My breathing sounded loud to me, too loud. Whoever it was, they paused right by my head. I could hear the faint rasp of their breath, human, unmistakable. We stayed like that, me holding still in the dark, them standing there, silent but present. Minutes dragged by like hours. Then, slow as it came, the sound moved away, soft steps fading into the trees. I lay there until dawn crept in. I hadn't slept more than scraps of restless minutes. When I finally crawled out, my legs were stiff, my mouth dry. I circled the tent, scanning the ground. The earth was scuffed in several spots, prints clear in the soft dirt. Not boots, shoes, worn thin soles. I didn't eat breakfast. I packed my gear fast, stuffing things down, not caring if they were neat. I kept scanning the trees, every crack and shadow. My back prickled with the thought of being watched. I wanted out. The trail back felt longer than before. My pack weighed double, my mouth dry, nerves stretched thin. Every so often I'd hear something behind me. A shift of branches, the faint tread of feet. I stopped once, spun around, flashlight in hand, even though it was day. Nothing, just trees. Hours later, I finally reached the trailhead, my truck parked where I'd left it. The sight of it nearly made my knees buckle. I threw the pack in, climbed behind the wheel, and drove without looking back. Even on the road, I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see someone following. Some figure stepping out from the trees. That night, safe in my house with locked doors and lights on, I thought about it. I went over every detail, every sound. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't my imagination. Someone had been out there moving around my camp in the dark, circling me as I lay in the tent. The worst part was not knowing why. They hadn't spoken, hadn't attacked, just lingered, watched. And I knew one thing for certain. Next time I went camping, I wouldn't go alone. I had been camping for years, but that trip was the one that changed how I looked at the woods forever. I used to think the scariest thing about camping was maybe hearing coyotes at night, or having a bear sniff around the tent. But I was wrong. The scariest thing is realizing you are not as alone as you think you are, and that someone out there has been watching you for longer than you could ever imagine. I picked a weekend in late September. The weather was cooling off, but not cold enough to make camping miserable. The forest was just starting to change color, and the air smelled like wet leaves and pine. I packed everything carefully, double-checking my gear: tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, first aid kit, and a small hatchet. I planned to stay 2 nights at a spot deep in the state forest, far away from the usual campsites. I had been there once before, hiking with friends, and I remembered an area near a small creek where the ground was flat and soft. I wanted quiet and I wanted space, so that's where I decided to go. The drive was about 3 hours from my place. By the time I got to the trailhead, the sun was low, throwing long shadows through the trees. I strapped on my pack and started walking. The forest grew darker quickly, and by the time I reached the creek, the light had faded into a deep blue. I set up camp in a hurry, pitching the tent and gathering enough wood to keep a fire going for a few hours. When the fire was burning steady, I sat back, ate a simple meal, and listened to the quiet. The woods were alive with small noises, the crack of twigs, the rustle of animals moving through the undergrowth. None of it bothered me. I was used to it. I had camped alone many times before, and those sounds were part of the rhythm of the forest. What I didn't notice then, and what still makes my skin crawl when I think about it, is how certain noises weren't there. No frogs croaking by the creek, no crickets chirping in the grass. Just the sound of branches moving in the wind and the occasional snap of something heavier than a rabbit shifting deeper in the woods. I put out the fire before midnight and crawled into my tent. I left the rain fly off so I could see the stars through the mesh. Sleep came slow, the ground cold beneath me. Sometime during the night I woke up. I don't know why. Maybe it was a noise, maybe just my body shifting, but when my eyes opened, I was alert. I lay still, listening. There was a faint crunching sound. Not steady footsteps, but the kind of sound someone makes when they move slowly through leaves, stopping and starting, like they're trying not to be noticed. I told myself it was probably a deer. They move strangely at night, pausing often. But something about it felt different. I realized the sound wasn't coming from the creek side or the thicker brush. It was behind my tent, in the direction I had come from on the trail. I held my breath, straining my ears, and the noise stopped completely. For minutes, maybe longer, there was nothing. Then, after a long silence, I heard the faintest scrape, like a shoe sliding on a rock. I froze. My heart pounded so loud I thought whoever was out there could hear it. I reached quietly for the hatchet I kept inside the tent. My hand gripped the handle tight and I waited. Nothing happened. The forest stayed still, silent except for the faint trickle of the creek. After an hour of lying awake, my body finally gave in to exhaustion, and I drifted into a restless sleep. Morning came with pale light. When I unzipped the tent, everything looked normal. The trees glowed with early sun and the air felt crisp. I stepped out, stretched, and walked around camp. That's when I noticed the ground behind my tent. The leaves there were disturbed, pressed down in a shape too wide for an animal. The prints weren't clear, but the way the leaves were moved told me someone had been standing there, close enough to touch the tent if they wanted. A sick feeling crawled up my throat, but I tried to reason it out. Maybe I had stepped there myself while setting up. Maybe an animal had wandered by. Something bigger, like a deer or a coyote. I forced myself to believe it, because I didn't want to pack up and hike all the way back after just one night. I spent the day hiking deeper into the forest. The trails were quiet and I didn't see another person. I tried to shake the uneasy feeling, but it clung to me. Every time I stopped, I thought I heard movement in the distance, quick, sharp snaps of branches that seemed to match my pace. I turned more than once, staring into the trees, but I never saw anything. By late afternoon, I returned to camp, sweaty and tired. I cooked dinner, drank some water from the creek after boiling it, and sat by the fire until the stars came out. I thought about leaving that night, but hiking the trail in the dark wasn't safe. I told myself I was imagining things, Fear does that to the mind, makes you see and hear what isn't there. The second night was worse. I fell asleep faster, but the noises came back. Again, I woke to the sound of movement outside the tent. This time it was clearer. Soft, deliberate steps circling. I held my breath, clutching the hatchet. The steps stopped near the front of the tent, and I heard the faint sound of fabric moving, like fingers brushing against the nylon. My body went cold. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. Silence swallowed the woods again. When morning came, I didn't want to get out of the tent. When I finally did, I found something that made my stomach turn. On a fallen log near the fire pit, someone had carved lines into the wood. 5 long scratches, deep and fresh. Not the marks of an animal. These were straight, deliberate cuts done with a blade. I stared at them, my chest tight. Someone had been there. Someone had stood in my camp while I slept. I didn't eat breakfast. I packed my gear fast, shoving everything into my backpack. I wanted out of there. The hike back to the trailhead felt endless. My legs shook with each step, but I pushed myself harder, glancing over my shoulder again and again. At one point I was sure I saw movement in the trees, a figure slipping out of sight just as I turned, but I kept moving. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was dipping again. My truck sat alone in the dirt lot. Relief washed over me when I unlocked the door and threw my pack inside. But that relief didn't last. On the driver's side window, drawn into the layer of dust, was a handprint. It was larger than mine, smudged but clear enough to see. It hadn't been there when I parked. I drove out of there fast, heart hammering, checking the rearview mirror more than the road. The whole way home I felt like someone was following, though no headlights appeared behind me. When I finally pulled into my driveway and locked the doors, I sat in silence, trying to steady my breathing. I never went back to that forest. I never camped alone again. For weeks afterward, I barely slept, jumping at every noise outside my house. I kept thinking about the handprint, about the scratches on the log, about the sound of fingers brushing against my tent in the dark. Someone had been out there watching me, following me, maybe waiting for the right moment. And the worst part is knowing I'll never know who it was, or what they wanted. But I know one thing for certain, I wasn't alone in those woods. Not for a single second. I went camping alone once in late summer, and I still remember every detail of that trip because of what happened. I had always liked being out in the woods by myself. I felt like it cleared my head. When I told people I preferred solo camping, most thought it was strange, maybe even reckless, but I enjoyed the silence, the calm, the slow rhythm of nature without anyone else around. That trip turned out to be very different from all the others I had ever taken. I picked a place that wasn't too far from the main road, but still felt isolated. It was deep enough into the trees that I couldn't hear cars passing, but not so far that I couldn't reach my truck if I needed to. I parked at the trailhead in the afternoon, strapped my backpack on, and started walking. The air was heavy with heat and the smell of pine, and the dirt path was dry, crunching under my boots. I carried more than I usually did because I planned to stay 2 nights, maybe 3. The trail led me through tall trees, their branches thick with late summer leaves, the sunlight breaking through in scattered patches on the ground. I stopped once to take a sip of water and let the sound of cicadas fill my ears. The woods felt alive but not threatening, just buzzing and shifting with insects and distant bird calls. When I reached the clearing I had picked out on a map earlier, it was almost evening. The clearing wasn't large, just a gap where grass grew tall between the trees. I could see a faint game trail cutting across it. It was quiet there, more still than the rest of the woods, as if the trees held their breath. I set my pack down, stretched my shoulders, and began to set up my tent. The ground was soft but firm enough to hold the stakes. I spread out my tarp, pitched the tent, and gathered a small pile of wood from the edge of the clearing for a fire. The wood was dry and I had packed fire starters, so within minutes I had a small flame going. I sat by it as the light faded, eating a simple dinner of jerky, nuts, and a piece of bread I had packed in foil. The first night seemed fine at first. I sat with the fire low, watching sparks float into the night sky. The crickets were loud, a constant blanket of sound. But as the night grew darker, I noticed how quickly the woods swallowed up the firelight. Beyond a few feet, the trees looked like walls of black. I tried to ignore that feeling of being surrounded. I told myself it was only the woods playing tricks on my eyes, the same way shadows moved in a dark room. I finally crawled into my tent and stretched out in my sleeping bag. The nylon walls felt thin, and I could hear every small sound outside. A twig snapping, leaves shifting, something scurrying through the grass. I told myself it was normal. Squirrels, raccoons, maybe a deer. I lay still, listening until I drifted off to sleep. Sometime later, I woke up. I didn't know what time it was because I hadn't checked my watch, but the fire outside had burned down. The woods were silent now, too silent. No crickets, no owls, no movement. Just stillness. My heart beat harder in my chest as I realized something had woken me. I lay frozen, my ears straining. Then I heard it again. A faint crunch of footsteps in the grass outside my tent. Not the quick scampering of an animal, but steady, careful steps. The sound moved slowly, circling. I held my breath. The steps stopped, then started again on the other side. I wanted to believe it was a deer, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Deer don't walk that way. Deer move with uneven steps, quick bursts. These were measured, deliberate. I stayed still for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only minutes. Eventually the sound faded. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there staring at the roof of my tent, waiting for the sun. When morning finally came, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The grass was damp with dew. My fire pit was nothing but ashes. I scanned the clearing, searching for prints. I found them near the edge. Shoe prints, not boots, not hiking shoes. They looked like worn sneakers, the tread shallow and smoothed down. The prints circled my tent just as I had heard in the night. I felt a tightness in my stomach. Someone had been out there, walking around me in the dark. I considered packing up and leaving, but I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was just someone passing through, maybe a lost hiker, but deep down I knew it wasn't. No hiker walks silently around another person's tent in the middle of the night without saying a word. Still, I stayed. I didn't want to give up my trip. I told myself I'd keep an eye out, be cautious, maybe cut it down to just one more night. I tried to push away the unease. That day I hiked a small loop away from my camp. I kept track of the trail carefully, marking a few trees with broken branches so I could find my way back. But even while hiking, I felt it, the sense of being watched. Whenever I stopped, the woods seemed to still around me, like something out there was pausing too. When I returned to my camp that evening, everything was as I had left it, at least at first glance. My tent stood, my pack was inside, my fire pit untouched. But then I noticed something strange. My backpack straps had been shifted. I had left them buckled, but now one was hanging loose. Inside, nothing was missing, but the way my things were arranged looked off. My food bag was under my spare clothes instead of on top. My flashlight was turned sideways. Small things, but enough to know someone had opened it. The fear sank deeper then. Someone had gone through my things while I was gone. I built another fire that night, larger than before, trying to push back the darkness. I sat close, the heat warming my face while the woods loomed just beyond the glow. I forced myself to stay awake, drinking water, chewing on snacks, poking at the fire. But eventually my body grew heavy, my eyes drooped, and I slipped into sleep sitting upright. A snapping sound woke me again. My fire had burned low, only glowing embers left. My mouth was dry, my heart pounding. I sat still, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. A branch breaking under weight. Then faintly, the crunch of footsteps again, slow and cautious. I turned my head just enough to peer into the dark beyond the fire. For a second I thought I saw movement. A shadow shifting between the trees. My breath caught in my throat, I didn't move. I just sat frozen until the sounds faded into the woods. I wanted to yell, to demand whoever it was to leave me alone, but I couldn't. My throat felt locked. When the first light of dawn came, I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, stuffing my gear into my bag without care. My hands shook as I broke down the tent. I wanted to be gone as fast as possible. As I lifted my pack, I noticed something on the ground near the fire pit. A single item I hadn't seen before. It was an old lighter, scratched and dented, the kind you refill with fluid. I didn't own one like that. Someone had dropped it. I stuffed it in my pocket and started walking. The woods felt different now, not peaceful, not calming. Every step felt like it took me deeper into something I shouldn't be in. I kept glancing over my shoulder, sure that someone was following. The trail seemed longer on the way back, the trees pressing close, the air heavy. Once I thought I heard steps behind me, but when I stopped, the woods went silent again. I forced myself to keep moving. When I finally reached the parking lot and saw my truck, relief washed over me. But that relief turned to dread as I got closer. On the driver's side window, faint but clear, was the smear of a handprint. Greasy, dirty, as if someone had leaned against the glass. I hadn't touched it when I parked. I unlocked the door quickly, threw my pack into the passenger seat, and slid in. The cab smelled faintly of sweat that wasn't mine. My stomach dropped as I realized whoever had been out there might have been inside my truck too. I drove off fast, not looking back. For weeks afterward, I kept checking behind me in mirrors, locking my doors twice, waking up at night to every sound. The lighter I had found sat on my desk. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. It was proof that what I felt out there was real. I never went camping alone again. I remember that trip like it happened yesterday. I had gone camping before, but this time I went deeper into the woods than I ever had in my life. The area was somewhere between state forest and unmarked land, a patch of rough terrain that didn't see many visitors. It wasn't the kind of spot with marked trails, fire pits, or cabins you could rent. It was the sort of place where you hiked in with your pack, picked a flat enough patch of ground, and called it yours for however long you stayed. I went alone. I left early in the morning and parked my truck at the last pull-off before the dirt road narrowed into nothing more than 2 ruts, swallowed by grass and weeds. I didn't want to risk the truck bottoming out or getting stuck where no tow truck would find me. So I threw my pack on my shoulders, locked up, and started walking. The air was cool when I started, my breath fogging slightly as I followed the faint trace of what used to be a logging trail. The woods were thicker than I expected. Branches clawed at my pack as I passed, and I had to duck under fallen trees more than once. By midday, the sun was straight above me, but its light barely reached the forest floor. The air smelled like pine and wet dirt, heavy and damp. Every sound echoed differently in woods that dense. Birds snapping twigs overhead, squirrels scattering through leaves. Even the faint drip of water from branches carried further than they should have. I hiked for hours, deeper and deeper, until I found a clearing about the size of a small house, flat enough for a tent and surrounded by thick brush that made it feel closed off from everything else. I set up camp slowly, methodically, because I knew I'd be staying at least 2 nights. The tent went up first. Then I cleared a small circle of rocks for a fire pit, collecting sticks and deadfall until I had enough for the evening. Sweat soaked through my shirt even though the air stayed cool. By the time I finished, the sun had already begun sinking behind the trees, and the woods around me had taken on a darker, heavier tone. That first night was uneventful. I cooked a small meal on the fire, sat watching the flames lick at the logs, and let the crackle fill the silence. When I finally crawled into my tent, I was tired enough to fall asleep quickly, though I woke a few times to small sounds outside, branches snapping, leaves crunching under something's weight. Each time I told myself it was just deer or raccoons, the normal life of the woods, and I forced myself to go back to sleep. Morning light poured weakly through the fabric of my tent when I unzipped the flap. A chill clung to the air, and the fire pit was nothing but gray ash. I made coffee on my small burner, ate a simple breakfast, and decided to wander further. I left most of my gear behind, taking only a knife, a bottle of water, and a small pack with snacks. The deeper I went, the more closed off everything felt. The ground turned uneven, with rocks jutting up like broken teeth and gullies carved into the earth by years of rainfall. There were no trails here, just raw, untamed forest. I walked until the sun sat higher than I expected, realizing I had gone much farther than planned. I stopped by a shallow creek, splashed water on my face, and sat for a while, letting the sounds of running water cover everything else. That was when I first noticed it. Somewhere off in the woods, behind the sound of the creek, came the faintest snap of branches, not the quick, scattered noise of an animal moving low and fast, but slow, Deliberate pressure, a step, then another. I froze, staring at the dense wall of green on the opposite side. For a long moment I told myself it was just another deer, maybe a bear, but it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like someone walking. I waited, listening hard, but after a while the woods went quiet again. Too quiet, no birds, no squirrels. Even the wind seemed to stop. I stood uneasy and began heading back toward camp. By the time I returned, the sun had dropped lower and my legs ached from the hike. The clearing looked exactly as I had left it, but something in the air felt heavier. I told myself I was overthinking it, that it was just the natural unease of being alone in a place so far from people. I cooked another meal, forced myself to eat even though my stomach felt tight, and tried to relax by the fire. That night, I woke up to sound again. This time it wasn't scattered or faint, it was clear. Footsteps. Slow, steady, crunching on dry leaves just outside the clearing. My body went rigid inside the tent. I held my breath, straining to hear past the thump of my own heartbeat. The steps circled, coming close to the tent, then fading back toward the brush. I stayed frozen, gripping the handle of my knife inside my sleeping bag, barely daring to breathe. The sound went on for what felt like an hour, then finally faded. I didn't sleep again that night. When the sun came up, I crawled out of the tent and scanned the clearing. My fire pit was cold. The rocks around it looked slightly disturbed, though I couldn't tell if it was just my imagination. I walked the edge of the clearing and froze when I saw them. Footprints. They weren't boot prints, not clean enough for that. Bare feet, human, unmistakable. The prints circled the clearing, cutting close to my tent before wandering off into the trees. My stomach twisted into knots. I hadn't seen another person since leaving the truck, and I had been miles from any marked trail. Someone had come into my camp in the middle of the night. I told myself to pack up and leave, but part of me didn't want to believe it was as bad as it felt. Maybe it was just a hiker, lost and passing through. Maybe they hadn't meant any harm. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The day passed in a haze. I walked the perimeter of the clearing more than once, checking the trees, scanning for movement. I barely ate. I kept the fire going long before the sun dipped, feeding it constantly just to have the light. When night finally came, I sat awake with my knife in hand, staring at the dark wall of trees, waiting. The footsteps came back. This time they were bolder, heavier. They circled closer, crunching in the brush just outside the firelight. I caught glimpses of movement. A shadow slipping between trees, the faint rustle of leaves pushed aside. Whoever it was stayed just beyond the edge where the light faded into dark. Watching. Waiting. Hours dragged by like that. My hand cramped from gripping the knife. My eyes burned from staring. Eventually, exhaustion forced me back into the tent, though I didn't dare sleep. I lay there in the dark, every small sound amplified, until finally, as dawn began to creep in, the noises faded. The next morning I knew I couldn't stay. I packed everything as fast as I could, stuffing gear into my bag with shaking hands. The fire was out before the sun fully rose, and I threw dirt over the pit just to be sure. I strapped my pack, tightened the straps, and started back the way I had come. But the woods didn't look the same anymore. The trees seemed thicker, the gullies deeper, the brush denser. I tried to retrace my steps, but every path looked wrong. Hours passed. The sun shifted. Sweat drenched me as I stumbled through undergrowth, climbing over rocks, ducking under branches. No matter which way I turned, I couldn't find the trail. Then I saw it again. Another footprint, bare pressed deep into the damp earth. Fresh. I froze, scanning the trees. No sound, no movement. Just silence. But the hair on my neck stood up and my chest tightened. Someone was out there moving with me, close enough to leave tracks but never close enough for me to see. Panic set in. I pushed harder, crashing through the woods without caring about the noise I made. My legs burned, my lungs screamed, but I didn't stop. Every few minutes I'd glance back, convinced I'd see someone stepping out of the shadows, but there was never anyone there. By late afternoon, my body was breaking down. My water was nearly gone. My food was barely touched, my stomach too twisted with fear to eat. I stumbled into another small clearing, dropped my pack, and tried to get my bearings. My compass spun uselessly. the needle twitching as if it couldn't settle. That night, I didn't make a fire. I didn't dare. I sat in the dark with my back against a tree, knife in hand, listening. The woods came alive with noise. Snaps, crunches, faint movement, always just far enough to keep me guessing. At one point, I swear I heard breathing. Slow, steady, not my own. I didn't sleep. When dawn came again, I pushed on, half delirious with exhaustion. I kept moving, dragging my body over rocks, through brush, across streams, anything to put distance between me and whatever was out there. My mind played tricks. Shadows looked like people, the wind sounded like voices, but the footprints never lied. They appeared over and over, always fresh, always leading just ahead of me. By the third day, I was done. My legs barely worked, my throat was raw, my body weak. Then, through the trees, I saw the faintest glint of sunlight on metal. I pushed toward it with everything I had left, branches slashing my face and arms until I broke through to the dirt road, my truck. It sat there exactly where I had left it, covered in dust and pine needles. I stumbled to it, nearly collapsing against the door as I fumbled for my keys. When I finally got inside, I locked the doors, started the engine, and sat shaking with both hands gripping the wheel. As I pulled away, something caught my eye. I never liked camping much, but I kept doing it because there was always something about the woods that made me feel both nervous and calm at the same time. Nervous because of how alone it felt. Calm because of the way the air was cleaner and the ground softened every step. That mix of comfort and unease was why I went back out there again and again, even though I never really trusted myself to relax when the trees started to press in around me. The trip I'm about to describe was one I took in late September. The air was cool but not cold, the kind of weather that keeps bugs away but doesn't bite at your fingers. I picked a state forest I had been to before. Nothing famous, just a quiet patch of woods with scattered trails that weren't kept up very well. I chose it for the same reason I always did. Hardly anyone else ever camped there. I parked at a gravel pull-off around mid-afternoon and packed my bag with what I thought I would need. A small tent, my sleeping bag, a cheap foam pad, a flashlight, an extra set of batteries, some water, jerky, nuts, a little propane stove, and a small pot. I strapped it all down and started walking. The trail cut into the trees quickly, and within 5 minutes the sound of cars on the highway was gone. The air smelled like damp leaves, and every step brought a crunch that sounded louder than it should have. I remember looking back once to see if anyone else was starting down the trail. But the gravel lot had been empty when I left, and it was still empty then. That should have been enough to settle me, but it didn't. I already felt that prickling in the back of my neck, the one that comes from being watched even though I knew there was no one around. I hiked for about 2 hours, longer than I needed to, because I wanted to be sure I was well away from the road. I passed a half-collapsed wooden bridge that looked like it had been abandoned decades ago. Then followed a faint deer trail until I found a clearing big enough to set up camp. The clearing was surrounded by tall oaks, their branches black against the fading sky, and the ground was littered with acorns and leaves. I dropped my pack there, set up the tent quickly, and gathered a few dead branches for a small fire. By the time I had the fire going, the sun had dropped low enough that shadows stretched long across the clearing. The orange light from the flames flickered against the trunks, making it look like the forest was breathing. I heated some water, dumped in a packet of instant noodles, and ate straight from the pot. It was a simple meal, but it tasted good with the smoke and the cool night air mixing together. That was when the unease started creeping back. It wasn't one sound or one sight. It was everything. The stillness. The fact that I couldn't hear any other campers, not even in the far distance. No voices, no dogs barking, no laughter echoing across the woods. Just the pop of my fire and the occasional sharp crack of a twig out beyond the tree line. Every time I heard one of those snaps, I froze, trying to judge how far it was. Trying to tell myself it was just an animal moving around. As the night thickened, I let the fire burn down low, then climbed into my tent. I zipped the flap shut and lay on top of my sleeping bag with the flashlight in my hand. The tent fabric was thin enough that I could see shapes when the fire flared, but soon there wasn't much light left, just darkness pressing in from every side. I didn't sleep. Not at first. I lay there listening, telling myself I would eventually drift off. I tried to focus on normal forest sounds, the soft rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant call of an owl, the occasional crack of something moving. But the cracks didn't sound random after a while. They sounded like steps. They came, then paused, came again, then paused, always out there in the dark where I couldn't see. I remember lying as still as possible, barely breathing, hoping it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon. But deer don't usually stop and stand quiet for long stretches, and raccoons don't walk with weight that makes branches snap like that. At some point, exhaustion must have pulled me under because I woke with a start hours later. The tent was damp with condensation and the air inside was cold. My neck ached from the way I had been lying. I listened again, and at first I heard nothing but my own heartbeat. Then faintly from the woods I heard the slow, careful crunch of footsteps again. They were closer than before. I froze, every muscle in my body screaming to move, but I couldn't. The steps came from the left side of the clearing, then stopped. For a long time, nothing. Then another crunch, even closer. Then silence again. Whoever or whatever it was moving slow, stopping often, like they didn't want to be noticed. I gripped my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I knew that if I lit up the tent, I would only see the fabric glow, and whoever was outside would know for sure I was awake. So I stayed in the dark, holding my breath, straining to hear. The steps circled halfway around my tent before they stopped. Then, very faintly, I heard the soft sound of something brushing against the nylon. Just a slight touch, but it was enough to make my whole body lock up. Whoever it was, they were right there, inches away from me. The brush stopped, and the silence dragged on so long I thought maybe I had imagined it. Then the steps moved away, back into the woods, slowly fading until I couldn't hear them anymore. I stayed awake until dawn, too scared to close my eyes again. When the first weak light filtered through the fabric, I unzipped the flap and looked out. The clearing was empty. Nothing seemed out of place, but in the soft mud near the edge of the trees I saw prints, not animal prints, boots. A man had walked around my tent in the middle of the night. My first instinct was to pack up and leave right then, but part of me told myself maybe it had been a hiker who had stumbled across my camp and left when they saw it was occupied. That explanation was thin, but it was enough to stop me from running back to the car. Instead, I told myself I'd keep my eyes open, and I'd cut the trip short if anything else felt wrong. I spent most of the day walking short loops around the clearing, trying to keep busy. I collected more wood, refilled my water bottles from a stream nearby, and forced myself to eat. But I kept noticing things that didn't sit right. A small pile of rocks stacked in a way that looked deliberate, not natural. A section of bark peeled off a tree with fresh cuts in the wood underneath. None of it proved anything, but every piece added to the unease. That night I built a bigger fire, hoping it would keep me safe, or at least make me feel less exposed. I sat close to it for hours, staring into the flames, listening to the forest. When I finally crawled into the tent again, I left the fire burning. Though I knew it would die before long, sleep wouldn't come. My ears caught every shift of the woods, every rustle. When the steps started again, I knew it wasn't in my head. They were back, moving just like the night before. Slow, careful, circling. I lay flat, holding my breath, feeling sweat run cold down my neck. The steps stopped, and then I heard a new sound. The faint tug of fabric. Someone was trying to pull at the zipper of my tent. That was when I moved. I snapped on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the thin nylon, and I yelled without words, just a raw sound to make whoever it was back off. The zipper stopped. The footsteps retreated fast this time, crashing through the underbrush as they ran. I didn't sleep after that. I sat up all night clutching the flashlight, waiting for the sky to turn pale again. When it finally did, I packed everything in minutes. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I just shoved the tent into my pack, doused the fire pit, and started back toward the car. The hike out was the longest 2 hours of my life. Every step I expected to see someone on the trail behind me or ahead, or waiting just off to the side. The forest didn't feel calm anymore. It felt like a trap, every tree hiding something I couldn't see. When I finally reached the gravel lot, my car was still there. But there was another set of tire tracks beside it that hadn't been there before, fresh, pressed into the dirt. I unlocked my car with shaking hands, tossed my pack into the back seat, and started the engine without looking around again. I drove until I hit the highway, then kept driving, not stopping until I was miles away. That was the last time I camped alone. The woods had always made me feel uneasy, but after that night I knew my unease wasn't just in my head. There really had been someone out there circling my camp, touching my tent, trying to get in, and if I hadn't woken up when I did, or if I had stayed another night, I don't know what would have happened. I tell myself I was lucky. Lucky I left when I did. Lucky I didn't let my curiosity or stubbornness keep me there one night longer. Lucky that all I carried home was the memory of boots in the mud and hands on my tent. Even now, years later, I don't go back to the woods. Not alone, not with friends. When I drive past a forest, I turn my eyes away from the tree line. Because I know what it's like out there when the fire burns low and the footsteps start. I know what it feels like to be watched by someone who doesn't want to be seen. And I know that if I ever set up camp again, maybe next time I wouldn't be lucky enough to walk away. I had been camping many times before, but that trip turned out different from all the rest. I wanted to get away for a while. Away from people, away from my phone, away from noise. The place I chose wasn't a busy campground with families, cars, and kids running around. I looked for something deeper, something harder to reach, far from the comfort of paved roads. I found a patch of forest on the map that was public land but had no official campsites. You could walk into it, pick your own spot, and stay as long as you wanted. That idea felt perfect to me. I packed light but careful. Tent, sleeping bag, cooking gear, a small axe, a knife, a water filter, and enough food for a few days. I had matches, a flashlight, an extra battery pack, and a small notebook. Nothing fancy, just what I thought I needed. The walk-in was harder than I expected. The trail started clear, but the deeper I went, the less it looked like a trail at all. Fallen branches blocked parts of it, and the weeds grew thick. I could tell not many people came here, which was exactly what I wanted. I walked most of the day. The sun felt heavy above the trees, and I was sweating under the weight of my pack. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No car noise, no far-off voices, not even the sound of planes. It was just me, the crunch of leaves under my boots, and sometimes the calls of birds. I passed a small creek and followed it for a while. The water would be good to have close by. I found a spot a short walk from it, a flat patch of ground with enough space for my tent. I set up camp there. The soil was soft but not swampy, and the trees around me were tall enough to give shade. I cleared out some sticks and rocks, pitched my tent, and built a fire pit with stones I collected from the creek bed. By the time everything was ready, the sun had started to dip and the shadows stretched long across the forest floor. I sat by the fire that night, cooking a simple meal, and thought about how far I was from everything. No one knew exactly where I was. I had told a friend I'd be camping for a few days, but not the exact spot. That thought felt freeing at first, but as the night grew darker, it started to feel heavier. The first night was quiet. Too quiet almost. I had camped enough to know that the woods were never really silent. Usually you'd hear crickets, frogs, or the movement of small animals in the leaves. That night it felt like the woods were holding their breath. I sat by the fire longer than I usually would, staring into the flames because they made me feel less alone. When I finally crawled into my tent, I lay awake for a long time listening to nothing. My heart beat hard in my chest for reasons I couldn't explain. The next morning felt normal again. I cooked breakfast, filled my water, and went for a walk to explore. I found a deer trail not far from my camp, narrow and beaten down through the brush. It felt strange walking it, like I was stepping where I didn't belong. I followed it for a while, then stopped when I saw something ahead. It looked like an old fire pit, long, cold, and covered in moss. Nearby, I saw the faint outline of a tent spot. The ground had been cleared at some point, though grass had grown back over most of it. It looked like someone had camped there long ago and never returned. That evening, as I cooked by the fire again, I thought about that old campsite. I wondered who had stayed there and why they had never come back. Maybe it was just another camper like me years ago who decided not to return, or maybe it was a hunter who had moved on. Still, it left me with a strange feeling, like I was standing in someone else's place. That night was different from the first. I heard noises. Not the normal ones, these were heavier. Branches snapped, and it wasn't the sound of small animals. Something moved in the woods around me. Slow, steady, and deliberate. I froze inside my tent, my ears straining. It circled, or at least it felt that way. Every time I thought it had gone, another crunch of leaves came from a different side. I held my knife in my hand inside the sleeping bag, staring at the tent wall, waiting for something to happen. Hours passed that way. At some point, exhaustion took me, and I drifted into uneasy sleep. When I woke, everything looked normal. The forest was calm, the fire pit cold. I checked the ground around my camp. I told myself I wanted to see if it had just been an animal, maybe a deer. But what I saw didn't sit right. There were marks, but not like the hoof prints of a deer. They were more like boot prints, faint but there. Human tracks. They didn't look fresh, but they also hadn't been there when I pitched camp the first night. It was like someone had walked around my tent while I was asleep. I spent the day trying to shake the thought. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe my mind had put shapes into the dirt that weren't there. I tried to keep busy, collected more wood, cleaned up the area, even fished a little in the creek. But no matter what I did, I couldn't stop looking at the tree line. Every shadow felt like it held someone standing still and watching me. That night I made the fire bigger than usual. I thought maybe light would keep whatever it was away, but the noises came back. Not just once or twice, constant all around me, like footsteps just outside of where the light reached. My stomach twisted and I felt sweat run down my back even though the air was cool. I didn't sleep much at all. Every time my eyes closed, I would snap awake again at the sound of something moving close. The next morning I made up my mind. I decided I would leave that day. Camping was supposed to be peaceful, but I didn't feel safe anymore. I packed slowly, trying to tell myself I wasn't rushing. The forest felt heavier as I worked, like the trees themselves leaned in closer. I kept glancing up, expecting to see someone between them. When my pack was ready, I doused the fire, slung it over my shoulder, and started back toward the trail I had come in on. My legs felt heavy and my ears strained at every sound. I kept telling myself not to look back, but I did. Again and again, and every time I thought I saw movement in the distance. Nothing clear, just the feeling of it. The deeper I walked, the worse it got. At one point, I found more prints in the mud, fresh this time. Boots. They were pointed in the same direction I was walking. Someone had been ahead of me, or maybe they still were. I didn't know what to think. I kept moving faster, my shoulders aching under the pack, my breath coming hard. As the day dragged on, I realized I had taken a wrong turn. The trail had split without me noticing, and now I was deeper in than I meant to be. My chest tightened at the thought of being lost. With the sun already tilting toward the horizon, I tried to retrace, but the woods looked different, every tree blending into the next. I kept walking, hoping to find a landmark, maybe the creek again. My legs burned and my water bottle was almost empty. Then I saw it, a clearing ahead. Relief flooded me, but it vanished as soon as I stepped in. In the middle of the clearing was another campsite. Old, broken, forgotten. A collapsed tent, shredded by time and weather. Rusted cans scattered on the ground. A fire pit filled with ashes gone gray. And next to it something that made my stomach drop. A single boot half buried in the dirt with the leather cracked and rotting. The air felt wrong there. Heavy, still, suffocating. I didn't want to look around more, but I couldn't stop myself. The trees around the clearing were carved. Not words, not symbols, just marks. Deep slashes, random, angry. I backed out of the clearing and turned fast, forcing my legs to move even though they felt weak. My thoughts spun, each one darker than the last. Whoever had stayed here before hadn't left in the normal way. Maybe they had never left at all. Maybe the person who had made those tracks around my tent was tied to this place. The sun dropped lower. I walked until the light bled out between the trees, then stopped because I couldn't see anymore. My chest hurt and I knew I had to set camp again, even though every part of me screamed not to. I chose a spot close to a rock outcrop, thinking at least one side would be covered. My fire was small, my tent rushed, and I sat in the dark with my knife on my knee. That night was the worst of all. The noises didn't just circle, they came closer. Twigs snapped, leaves crunched, and more than once I thought I saw the shadow of someone just at the edge of the firelight. My body shook with exhaustion, but fear kept me awake. Hours passed like that, me staring into the trees, waiting. At one point, I swore I heard breathing, slow and steady. Not my own, not far from the tent wall. I didn't sleep. When the sky finally lightened, I was already packed. My body felt hollow, my mind frayed. I walked until my legs almost gave out. And finally, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw the faint line of the real trail again. Relief hit me so hard I almost collapsed. I followed it step after step until I reached the edge of the forest. My car was still there, untouched, waiting. I dropped my pack inside, started the engine, and drove without looking back. Even now, I don't know for sure what I ran into. Maybe it was just someone else in the woods. Maybe they were hunting, maybe they were lost. Maybe they weren't dangerous at all. But the way they moved, the way they circled my camp, the marks on the trees, the old campsite, I can't make sense of it. All I know is that I've never camped alone since. The memory of those footsteps outside my tent, steady and patient in the dark, is enough to keep me close to the safety of others. I always thought of camping as a way to disconnect from the noise of the world. When life got heavy, I would take my gear, pack food and water, and head out into the woods. Being alone under the trees, far from traffic and lights, helped me clear my head. It always gave me peace. I never thought of it as dangerous. Of course, I knew about the risks, bears, snakes, accidents, but I trusted my experience. I had camped alone more times than I could count. I thought I understood the woods. That night taught me I didn't. I had driven out to a state forest in late summer. The air was still warm, but the nights carried a chill. I picked a spot I hadn't camped before, a few miles down an old service road. It was marked on a map I'd bought years ago. The road was rough, but my truck made it through. I parked near a clearing and loaded my backpack with the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, knife, flashlight, small hatchet. I strapped on a headlamp as the sun was already dipping low. The trail wasn't well marked, but I found my way in, walking deeper until the noise of the road was gone. I picked a site near a cluster of tall pines, ground covered with soft needles. It looked perfect. I set down my pack and started working. Setting up the tent was routine. My hands knew the motions. Poles together, fabric stretched, stake down. I gathered dry wood, built a small fire ring with rocks, and got a flame going before it grew too dark. The fire cracked as I heated a simple meal. The forest around me was alive with the usual night sounds: crickets, frogs, the occasional rustle of small animals in the brush. I felt at ease. I leaned back against a log and watched the stars appear. Out here, the sky always seemed larger, as if the trees cleared a window straight to the universe. Hours passed. The fire burned down to glowing coals. The woods grew quieter. I crawled into the tent, zipped the flap, and slid into my sleeping bag. The forest air was cool, and the silence was heavy but calming. I lay there listening to the faint hiss of wind moving through branches. Somewhere deep in the night, I woke. It wasn't sudden like from a dream. It was the kind of waking where your body senses something before your mind understands. At first, I thought it was just the forest being louder than usual. But then I noticed it wasn't the regular kind of noise. It was the absence of it. The crickets had stopped. The frogs, too. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. I lay still, every sense sharpened. Then I heard it. A crunch, faint but clear. The sound of a foot pressing on dried needles. My first thought was deer, but it didn't sound like a four-legged step. It was one at a time, slow, careful, human. My heart began to hammer in my chest. I turned onto my side quietly, straining to hear. Another step. This one closer. The sound of weight shifting, branches brushing. Whoever it was, they were moving deliberately, not stumbling like a lost hiker. I reached for my knife, keeping it close. My mind raced. It could be another camper, someone wandering. But at that hour? No light, no voice, no sign of normal movement. Just deliberate steps circling the area. The sound moved around the tent, fading, then returning from a different angle. My breathing slowed as I tried to control it. I lay still, pretending to sleep, but every nerve in me was alive. I pictured the fire ring outside, the pack leaning against the tree, the faint glow of coals that might still mark my camp. Whoever was out there had to see it. They knew I was here. The steps went quiet for a long time. I waited, tense, every second dragging. Eventually, I must have drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep. because I woke again when the first light touched the tent walls. I unzipped the flap carefully and looked around. The fire pit was cold. My pack was where I left it. Nothing seemed disturbed. But when I scanned the ground, I saw impressions in the soft soil. Not boots exactly, but the shape of shoes, not mine. They circled near the trees, coming within 20 feet of my tent before looping away. The sight chilled me more than the night noises. It confirmed I hadn't imagined it. Someone had been there close enough to see me, close enough to walk into my camp if they wanted. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe another camper passed through. Maybe they got lost. Still, the prints lingered in my mind as I packed up breakfast. I thought about leaving. My truck wasn't far, but part of me resisted. I had camped alone so many times before. I didn't want fear to dictate me. I convinced myself it was harmless and decided to stay one more night. The day passed quietly. I hiked deeper into the woods, trying to enjoy the streams and ridges. Still, I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. Every time a branch snapped, I looked over my shoulder. When the wind moved the trees, I thought I saw movement at the edge of my vision. By evening, I was back at camp. I built a bigger fire than usual. The flames gave me comfort, their light pushing back the dark. I ate slowly, listening, alert for anything unusual. The forest sounds had returned, crickets and frogs as usual. It gave me a small sense of normalcy. When I finally crawled into the tent again, I left the knife beside me and the flashlight within reach. Sleep came in small broken pieces. Sometime past midnight, I woke again. The same feeling pressed on me, wrongness. The air was heavy, quiet. Then came the sound. Not footsteps this time, but something dragging faintly against the ground. A soft scrape. It moved slowly, then stopped. My skin went cold. I turned the flashlight in my hand, thumb on the switch, but didn't turn it on yet. I listened, holding my breath. The scrape came again, closer to the tent. Then silence. I waited, muscles locked. Finally, I clicked the light on and pointed it at the fabric wall. The beam cast faint shapes through it. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow shift just beyond the tent. Not animal-like. Human. Standing. My heart pounded so loud I thought whoever was out there would hear it. I clenched the knife, trying to prepare myself for whatever came next. But nothing happened. No voice, no movement, just stillness outside. I stayed awake until dawn, the flashlight in my grip, the knife tight in my hand. When light came, I forced myself to unzip the tent and look. The ground outside was marked again. More shoe prints. This time closer, circling tighter around the tent. And there, beside the fire ring, was something that made my stomach twist. My backpack unzipped, though I had closed it before sleeping. Some of my food was missing. Nothing else, that was enough. I knew this wasn't random. Someone was messing with me, watching me, testing how close they could get. I packed quickly, stuffing everything into the bag. I doused the fire and slung the pack over my shoulders. My nerves burned with urgency. The woods felt different now. Not peaceful, but hostile. The hike back felt longer than before. Every crack of a twig behind me made me whip around. More than once, I thought I caught movement in the distance. Someone ducking behind a tree, slipping into the brush. Always gone when I focused. When I finally reached the truck, relief washed over me. I tossed the gear into the bed and climbed in fast. I started the engine, gravel crunching as I pulled onto the rough road. In the rearview mirror, just before the forest closed behind me, I saw it. A figure standing at the tree line, half hidden in shadow, not moving, just watching as I drove away. I never went back to that forest. I still camp, but never alone and never without checking the area for signs of others. That night taught me the woods hold more than animals and silence. Sometimes it's people you have to fear most, and the scariest part isn't what they do. It's not knowing why they're there in the dark, watching.